In a pre-90s era of wrestling, weekly television was never the focus. No, whenever you saw something on an episode of WWE Superstars or WCW Saturday Night, it was usually a basic squash match being used to set up a pay-per-view or a live event loop. But then things changed with the introduction of Monday Night Raw in 1993, a live weekly show which would rewrite the rulebook for how the industry would operate going forward. How would the story of Raw play out over the years with all of its ups and downs? Well, join us as we take a deep dive into the entire history of Monday Night Raw right now. It all began in 1993. That was when, as WWF was at one of its lowest ebbs both creatively and financially, what with the golden era having only recently come to an end and the steroid trial still being a major story, Vince McMahon decided to try and breathe some fresh life into his promotion. And the way he would do this would be by coming up with the idea of holding a 1-hour live weekly show named Monday Night Raw live from the Manhattan Center in New York City. What was going to separate this from weekly television of the past? Well, for one, it wasn't just going to be a series of squash matches designed to build up bigger events as most weekly TV had been before across all wrestling companies. No, there was going to be regular important storyline advancement here. And with it being a live show, there was a definite sense that anything could happen while it was on the air. Sure, those early years would feature a lot of growing pains as Raw attempted to find itself, but even during this rough sketch period where it was figuring out what it was, there were some iconic moments to be found. Moments like the 1-2-3 Kids' famous against all odds victory over Razor Ramon, or the Loser Leaves Town match between Ric Flair and Mr. Perfect. Hell, if you go back and watch those early shows now, well, it's certainly a far cry from the Monday Night Raw we have today, and while it's definitely spotty in its quality, there's a lot of charm to be found there with such an experimental show being held in such a small venue. Really, it's not too dissimilar from what you might see in something like a Game Changer Wrestling today. That said, for every positive there was at least one negative, as with WWF never struggling more than they were business-wise at this time, they just couldn't seem to build any real momentum with this new concept. So that was why, pretty quickly, the idea of it airing live would be largely abandoned, with the show instead being pre-taped ahead of time. And this proved to be a major detriment to the show when WCW launched Monday Nitro in 1995 as a direct competitor and very quickly started stealing all the headlines. Sure, during those early months of the Monday Night Wars, Nitro and Raw would often be able to trade wins in the ratings, even if Raw was taped and Nitro was live. But the gap in popularity would quickly grow in WCW's favor once the NWO was formed in the summer of 1996. Yes, we were now fully in the Monday Night Wars, and this would be a rough period for Vince McMahon, at least at first, because between 1996 and early 1998, Raw would be absolutely slaughtered by Nitro in the ratings. Obviously then, at a certain point, it became clear that something new was going to be needed in order to get some buzz back on WWF's side. But finding that new thing would prove to be easier said than done, because while Nitro was often running out of big arenas at this point, and was featuring some of the biggest stars the industry had ever seen, names like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Sting, and Ric Flair, WWF's lull in business meant they were on occasion having to resort to film shows in high school gyms with a roster which was far lighter on star power. A roster which, Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart aside, was often pretty threadbare. But then something would happen which finally turned the company's fortunes around. As 1996 started bleeding over into 1997, Stone Cold Steve Austin started rising to the forefront. And while this wouldn't lead to a change in business right away, it would lead to Raw in 1997, arguably the creative peak of WWE's long history. Really, here was the point where things started to turn around, as with Austin's continued rise mixing in with things like the Bret Hart-Shawn Michaels feud and the great years people like The Undertaker and Mick Foley were having, it was clear there was a change in the air. Hell, it would be in 1997 that we'd get iconic Raw moments like Bret Hart shooting on Vince McMahon in the middle of the ring while a steel cage was being deconstructed around him, or Mick Foley reintroducing his most sadistic alter ego of Cactus Jack. And if that wasn't enough, it was also the year of Sunny Days driving a further wedge between the Hitman and the Heartbreak Kid, as well as it being the year of Stone Cold giving a stunner to his boss in front of a raucous Madison Square Garden crowd. Really, there was an energy to Raw here which it hadn't really felt before. It came across as the cool thing to watch all of a sudden. And this transformation into Raw being the cool show would be solidified by early 1998, as it was once the Austin-McMahon feud took off post-WrestleMania 14 that Raw would finally beat Nitro in the weekly ratings for the first time in 83 weeks. That's right, after being on the brink of going under in late 1997, WWF had managed to turn things around, and the content they were putting out on Raw every week was a large part of the reason for that. Seriously, at this point, the once struggling show had suddenly become the hottest thing for any wrestling fan to watch, as the antics of the Rattlesnake, D-Generation X, the Brothers of Destruction, and others became must-see TV. This was a time that you couldn't walk around a playground without hearing people talk about what The Undertaker and Kane had been doing the night prior, or what might be happening with The Rock the following week. Hell, it was The Rock who helped give us one of wrestling TV's greatest moments on the January 4th, 1999 episode of Raw when he dropped the WWF title to Mick Foley, all to the sound of one of the most catastrophic pops ever heard. And that would be only one of the many iconic moments on Raw during the Attitude Era. After all, who could forget about Stone Cold dousing the corporation with a beer bath, DX invading Nitro in a Jeep, the rise of the McMahon-Helmsley era, Austin versus Tyson, or one of the highest rating segments in wrestling history to this day, the This Is Your Life segment between Mankind and The Rock. And things would only reach higher highs as 2000 came around and the Attitude Era went from strength to strength, with The Rock spending much of that year at the helm on account of Steve Austin's absence to go get neck surgery. Sure, losing their top star could have been a disaster here for WWF and could have easily seen WCW take the lead again, but luckily for them, Dwayne Johnson would prove to be just as popular as the Rattlesnake, if not more so. So well would things be going for Vince McMahon's company here, in fact, that come early 2001, it was clear that Raw had soundly beaten Nitro in the Monday Night Wars once and for all, and that was solidified when, in March of that year, Ted Turner's promotion was sold to Vince McMahon for pennies on the dollar, with this being announced to the world live on Raw via a now famous simulcast segment. But while this could have represented the start of an ever stronger era of dominance for WWE, it quickly became apparent that the lack of competition was causing the company to start resting on their laurels creatively, something which was evident in the severely botched invasion angle. So because of that, as the Ruthless Aggression era began, there was a definite sense that Raw wasn't the must-see show it had once been to anyone. No, while there were plenty of highlights to be found here in the work of Shawn Michaels, Rob Van Dam, and others, lowlights like the Katie Vick angle and the infamous HLA segment all served to turn a significant percentage of fans away. How would WWE try to stop these fans from leaving? Well, the introduction of a brand split would be one thing they'd tried early on, with this formally dividing Raw and Vince McMahon's other weekly show Smackdown into two separate rosters. But this ended up doing more harm than good to the Red brand as it happened, because for a large part of the Ruthless Aggression era, SmackDown was seen by the majority of people as being the better show, being booked as it was by Paul Heyman and featuring the SmackDown 6 of Rey Mysterio, Edge, Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Chavo Guerrero. Still, even if this was the case, Raw was always going to be the flagship, and that was evidenced when, in 2005, John Cena was drafted over there to fully start his run as new face of the company. But even if John Cena was helming Raw by the time it reached the mid-2000s and was doing a good job of carrying the company on his shoulders as he did so, there remained a feeling that the show had lost part of what made it so special during the Monday Night Wars, and that this was something it might never be able to regain again. It just didn't have that same level of vitality or excitement as it once had when there was a strong competitor nipping at its heels and forcing it to be at its best each and every week. So what it needed to do then, in lieu of finding a new competitor, was move on completely and stop trying to live off the fumes of the Attitude Era. What few could have expected, however, would be how dramatically it would shift away from the blood and guts of that time once the late 2000s came around, as that was when an all-new era of the show would begin, one known as the PG era. Now, there are a number of reasons why WWE went PG in 2008, with increased sponsorships with children's toy brands being one, and Chris Benoit being the obvious other big one. But whatever the reasons, the results were the same, and those results were a show which was now going to be far more child and sponsor-friendly going forward. So because of that, fully gone were the days of people like Steve Austin cursing up a storm on TV, or wrestlers bleeding at every opportunity, and on top of that, gone were some of the racier angles which had captured the attention of young men so much during the turn of the millennium period. Was this a good move? Well, while to some fans it wasn't, the reality was something had to change about the show, as by then the late 90s had long since passed. Honestly, it's just the reality of having to evolve with the times. Different audiences are going to want different things during different time periods. What would this PG era entail? Well, in line with the kind of presentation the face of the company John Cena was putting out, things would get a lot more cartoonish again, as they had during the mid-90s when Raw was first starting. And as you might expect, this angered a portion of young males who had first been introduced to the show during the Monday Night Wars. Yes, while it certainly was effective for kids, this was really the true start of Raw's downfall for a while there. And a large part of the reason for that was a series of botched big storylines which ended up doing more to upset people than to engage them. We're talking about things like the unintentional comedy that was Million Dollar Mania here, a segment in which Vince McMahon got rickrolled on live TV at one point, and not just that either. No, there was also the infamously bad anonymous Raw general manager, as well as the failure of the Nexus, a group which looked to be a surefire hit following their excellent debut, but which quickly frittered away into nothingness soon thereafter. But even if that was the case, and the show was struggling to keep a lot of older fans invested, it still managed to maintain a strong enough audience to get decent TV ratings on a weekly basis, even if that audience was now starting to dwindle. And again then, because the audience was starting to fall, Vince McMahon was forced to constantly try out even more new ideas in order to get people back on board. The only problem was, like with those we mentioned a moment ago, few of those ideas proved to be hits with fans. No, things like the guest host era of Raw ended up being a bit of a wash, as most people saw it as being a distraction from the actual thing they wanted to see, too much of a focus on ratings grabs and not enough of a focus on the wrestling show. And when it came to Raw expanding to 3 hours in length in 2012, well, that proved to be a breaking point for even some of the most hardcore fans, as being asked to devote that much time every week to a show they weren't fully in love with anymore felt like way too much, especially when Smackdown was also still technically on the air. That said, even if there were increased struggles with Raw, there were still moments that broke through and shone brightly, moments which kept the core fan base interested. Of course, we're talking about moments such as CM Punk's famous pipe bomb promo here, which he carried out on June 27th of 2011, a promo which changed the course of his career forever and even brought back some lapsed fans for a while. And not long after this, the Red brand, which had by this point become the only brand really worth paying any attention to on account of SmackDown largely becoming a recap show, would get some fresh life with an influx of new stars again, stars like Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Bray Wyatt. But for as much as those new stars helped to keep things going, there was also a general sense amongst fans that this was a period in the show's history where things were becoming too reliant on stars of the past, with shows like Raw Legends Night or Old School Raw becoming an all too common occurrence as names like DX and Steve Austin were brought out to steal the attention away from the current day names. Why were shows like this such a focus during the 2010s? Well, because they drew ratings, something Vince McMahon was increasingly desperate to do as he saw Raws continue to fall in spite of all his attempts to stop the bleeding. And the general fan frustration could all be summed up and encapsulated by the response to one person, Roman Reigns. You see, as the decade reached its latter half, it was clear that John Cena was starting to wind things down in the ring, so a new face of the company was going to have to be chosen. The only problem was, the person WWE chose did not match up with the person fans wanted to see. No, with this being around about the time people like Daniel Bryan and CM Punk had risen to the top and proven that smaller indie guys were more in line with what 2010s wrestling fans were into, people who were less like the cartoon superheroes of the past and were instead more relatable and human in their presentation, that was not what they would get. Sure, some of these guys would get pushed, but for as much as fans protested during things like the Yes Movement, the more traditional mold of WWE superstars would always be pegged a level higher. And that was never clearer than with Roman Reigns. That said, despite it not being a popular move at the time, pushing the big dog did make a lot of sense in a lot of ways, and it didn't have to be a bad idea. After all, Roman Reigns was very talented and charismatic, something he's shown us all too well in recent years. And even if he got his foot on the door on account of his family ties, it wasn't like that was a negative against him. No, there was no law saying someone had to graft on the indie circuit for 10 years before making it to WWE. The real problem with him back then, though, was the way he was being presented, with this making him come across as a lot less like Bret Hart and a lot more like Lex Luger, dooming him for failure right from the start. Obviously then, this had a big impact on the popularity of Raw as a whole, as Roman was the guy whose face was front and center every week. But he wasn't the only focus of the show here. No, come the mid-2010s, the Red brand would start to feature an influx of female talent as WWE's Women's Revolution occurred and saw the rise of acts like Becky Lynch, Sasha Banks, Charlotte Flair, and Bayley. Yes, this was a big win for Vince McMahon, as it helped to get more young women watching the show, an audience which had always been underserved for this company. But even if the women were now killing it, this wasn't enough to offset the weaknesses found elsewhere on the show. So as you would expect, things continued to struggle from a ratings perspective as the 2010s drew to a close, and it felt more and more like what Raw was giving its audience just wasn't ever going to be able to match up with what that audience wanted again. Even when a great storyline would break through, something like the aforementioned Daniel Bryan's Yes movement, the Kevin Owens-Chris Jericho storyline which gave us the fantastic Festival of Friendship, or Seth Rollins fracturing the Shield in shocking fashion when he turned on Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose, then shacked up with the Authority instead, it would never last for long enough to turn overall fan sentiment on the show around, as inevitably the status quo would always seem to return. And with the reintroduction of the brand extension around this time, it only added more woes to Monday Night Raw's plate, as now, once again, the roster was being split between two shows. So this meant that, despite having 3 hours of TV to fill every week, there was a smaller pool of stars from the Red brand to choose from at any given time. That said, for all these complaints people had, throughout this period, WWE's business remained strong in many ways. Yes, money was coming in huge numbers now, as even if ratings were low in comparison to what they'd been in years prior, they were still good in relation to everything else that was on TV at that point. And for all the grumbling people had about there being too much of a focus on stars from the past, a devoted audience continued to tune in and were satisfied enough with the bright spots they got every Monday night. Still though, the struggles in perception were undeniable. But for as much as these struggles were real, they were nothing compared to what was about to come, as Monday Night Raw was about to hit what in many ways was its toughest era yet, an era which would begin in the spring of 2020. What happened here? Well, with the world going into lockdown, suddenly no fans were allowed in attendance at shows for the foreseeable future, with this pretty much instantly removing any atmosphere from TV every week and making it very difficult to replicate that atmosphere through alternative means like the Thunderdome. As well as this, only a few months prior to the lockdown, an all-new weekly TV show had been created when the then upstart All Elite Wrestling launched their live weekly flagship, Dynamite. And now, with some new competition, it helped to inspire change. Unfortunately though, it was very hard to make any substantial positive changes during an era where no fans were allowed to come to shows. No, all the promotion could do throughout 2020 and well into 2021 was maintain things by pushing people like Drew McIntyre in the top spot. And this allowed them to keep going as the lockdown ended in the summer of 2021, and finally, episodes of Raw were packed with fans once more. Thank God they did keep going here then, because not long after fans returned was when things would start turning around for Raw again. What happened to cause this? Well, the main thing would be the exit of Vince McMahon. Yes, after leaving the company for the first time in the summer of 2022, the boss would be out and the reins of creative for the flagship going forward would instead be handed over to Triple H. How would Triple H do in this role? Very well, as it happened, because his booking suddenly gave Raw a breath of fresh air which it had been desperately seeking for so long. And that, combined with the continued adventures of Roman Reigns and the Bloodline, suddenly made WWE the hot ticket once more. And while much of this storyline played out on Smackdown, whenever the Tribal Chief made an appearance on Raw, the show was appointment viewing. That's right, after turning heel in the summer of 2020, Roman had morphed into a mob boss-like character who ruled his family with an iron fist. And it was that angle which, along with Triple H's overall creative direction and Cody Rhodes jumping ship for AEW, helped to get fans back on board again. But it wasn't just that, of course. No, it was also the focus on building new stars again and spending less time focusing on legends of the past. Yes, the 2020s would see the rise of names like Sami Zayn, Rhea Ripley, Jey Uso, Dominic Mysterio, and more, with all this helping to give Raw a strong sense of identity in this new era, which wasn't just it being the same show of past generations. No, this was a Monday Night Raw for the modern audience, and that push to take the show in such a new direction resulted in big ratings increases and a huge renewed wave of fan interest in the product overall. Of course, another big factor in the change of how Raw looked and felt here could be found in the new owners of WWE. Who were these owners? Well, that would be Ari Emanuel's newly founded TKO Group. That's right, after Vince McMahon decided to put the company up for sale in 2023, a suitor was soon unveiled in the form of the Endeavor owner. And this would truly lead to an all-new era for Raw, and for WWE as a whole, as now for the first time this was not a family-run business. Rather, it was one owned by a major sports conglomerate. So with that, fans suddenly saw an increased focus on integration with other products like UFC, as well as an added emphasis on outside celebrity involvement to try and raise the company's mainstream footprint once more. And all of this positive buzz the company was creating here would arguably reach its apex at WrestleMania 40, where, after a year-long build, Cody Rhodes was finally able to end Roman Reigns' 1,316-day-long reign as undisputed WWE Universal Champion. Sure, this moment itself didn't happen on Raw, but it had a huge impact on the buzz around the Red brand, as in the weeks and months both leading up to the show and following it, Monday nights hadn't felt so hot for wrestling fans since the turn of the millennium. Seriously, ratings were at the highest they'd been in decades, fan satisfaction was reaching peak levels, and every time WWE went to an arena to host their flagship show, that arena would be completely sold out. Where could Raw possibly go from there? Well, how about the biggest streaming platform in the world? Yes, it would be in January of 2025 that the Red brand started airing live around the world on Netflix every week. Obviously then, this has only strengthened what had started out as an experiment in live programming all the way back in 1993, as now being the undisputed king of WWE's portfolio, even more so than a Smackdown or arguably even a WrestleMania. That's right, to look at how far Monday Night Raw has come since its creation over 30 years ago is quite a thing today. Sure, it's had its low points, as any TV will inevitably have, but over the years, it's given us countless iconic moments which will be replayed from now until the end of time. And that's something which doesn't appear like it'll be changing anytime soon, with Raw continuing to be the flagship of WWE, and with it being in a stronger place financially now than it's ever been, it's going to continue to be a part of wrestling fans' lives for a long time yet to come. For a long time in WWE's history, there were only a limited amount of pay-per-views a year. Certainly not enough to where there was at least one airing every month as there is nowadays. What changed when it came to that? Well, it has everything to do with the story we're going to be looking at today, the story of a series of shows which occurred during the mid to late 90s. That's right, it's time to tell the whole tale of the original WWE B shows, how they started, where they went, and what their ultimate legacy was. So join us as we take a deep dive into the history of In Your House. It all started in early 1995, the point where WWF was really struggling to keep its head above water. Why was this? Well, with the steroid trial and the Ring Boy scandal both doing a number on the company's public perception, as well as the exit of pretty much all of the big names of the 80s seriously thinning out the roster, Vince McMahon had never felt less relevant. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there was also the issue of World Championship Wrestling, his chief competitors at the time. Sure, they weren't quite in the midst of their boom in popularity, which began in mid-1996 with the formation of the New World Order yet, but even at this point, it was clear that WCW was strong enough to eat a large part of the WWF's lunch. Hell, so well was WCW doing in comparison to WWF here, then president of the company Eric Bischoff had made the decision to expand his pay-per-view calendar so that there was a big show once every month, a move which some thought might be going too far at first, but which ended up being a big hit and making the Atlanta promotion a lot of extra cash. So seeing the success of this then, Vince McMahon decided to follow suit for the WWF, with that leaving him to come up with an idea for a special series of B pay-per-views named In Your House. How would these shows be different to the Big Five which already existed in WWF at this point in the form of WrestleMania, the Royal Rumble, SummerSlam, Survivor Series, and King of the Ring? Well, for one, they'd be cheaper to buy. Yes, rather than costing $30, these would be priced at a mere $15. That said, there would be an hour's less worth of content here too, as instead of the 3-hour-long shows WWF pay-per-views usually gave us back then, the initial In Your House shows would all be 2 hours in length. And when it came to the talent who could be found here, that would also be a step below what you might find at one of the bigger shows. Sure, you would get stars, but only a portion of them if you were watching on TV, as many of the big names would be saved for dark matches specifically for the live crowd. Needless to say then, this was considered a risky move at the time, as while WCW had found a lot of success in adding to their pay-per-view schedule, they were filling up all of their cards with the top names. So to put out something that was so clearly lesser to something like a WrestleMania? Well, there were worries that fans wouldn't buy the shows, even with the lesser price point. But Vince McMahon, quickly running out of money and in need of something to boost interest in his company, was desperate enough to take the risk, and that led to the inaugural event in the series happening on May 14th of 1995, with this one predictably being called In Your House 1 Premiere. What was the card like for In Your House 1? Well, as an impressive 7,000 people filled up the Onondaga County War Memorial in Syracuse, New York, the pay-per-view portion of the show would be kicked off with a true hidden gem in Bret Hart vs. Hakushi. That's right, if there's any reason to go back and watch this show, then this is it. As for the rest of the proceedings, well, they wouldn't be as impressive, because truly living up to the B-Show moniker here, what followed would include stinkers like Razor Ramon beating Jeff Jarrett and the Roadie in a handicap match, Mabel getting the better of Adam Bomb in a King of the Ring qualifier, the Hitman pulling double duty for a weak bout with Jerry the King Lawler, and Diesel further proving why he was not the guy to carry the company when he successfully defended his WWF title against Sid. As you might expect then, this was not a particularly well-received show. Hell, even the fact that an actual house was given away to an 11-year-old boy here on the pay-per-view as part of a competition McMahon had been running as a publicity stunt couldn't help to make things feel worthwhile. But while critical opinion of In Your House 1 premiere was low, it ended up doing pretty well on pay-per-view, with it drawing a total of 332,000 buys, and as a result, a nice chunk of money for the company. So that meant it wasn't long before a second edition of the show was airing on July 23rd of the same year. What would that edition of the series be called? Well, this one went by the name of In Your House 2, The Lumberjacks, a nod to the fact that the main event would be a lumberjack match once more pitting Diesel and Sid against one another for the WWF title. Yes, this was also not a show which received much critical acclaim similar to In Your House 1. But then, how could the situation be any different when the threadbare 1995 WWF roster on display here gave us a card which included Sunday Night Heat level matches such as the Roadie versus the 1-2-3 Kid, Bam Bam Bigelow versus Henry O. Godwin, and Men on a Mission versus Razor Ramon and Savio Vega. Sure, there was at least one highlight in the form of Shawn Michaels defending his Intercontinental title against Jeff Jarrett in another hidden gem, and the live crowd did get to see dark matches from the likes of Bret Hart and The Undertaker. But again, like the first edition, this wasn't enough to make it feel like In Your House was of any real consequence. Even with this being the case though, it once again did a pretty good pay-per-view buy rate, 280,000 this time. So it was clear to Vince McMahon here that while fans might not have loved the shows, a good portion of them were buying them anyway. And as long as that continued to be the case, he was going to be more than happy to keep making money off of them. Really, the only question was when would In Your House 3 air, and the answer to that was on September 24th, 1995, with this one being given the subtitle of Triple Header on account of there being 3 purported main events. Of course, it should be mentioned here that none of these subtitles were known to fans at the time, as the first 6 In Your House shows would all be given these retroactively when the 6th edition started doing it officially. Whatever the name though, the event was the same either way, and that event was another ropey one to say the least. Why was this? Well, in another house show level effort, what fans got for their $15 was bouts like Savio Vega versus Waylon Mercy, Dean Douglas versus Razor Ramon, and Bret Hart fighting Jean-Pierre Lafitte for his jacket. Come on now, were it not for the fact that these shows were bringing in some extra money to a then cash-strapped WWF, there would be little reason for them to exist at all. And things wouldn't get much better at In Your House 4 Great White North on October 22nd, 1995. No, that show would be another underwhelming one, what with the card being made up of matches such as Goldust versus Marty Jannetty, Mabel versus Yokozuna, and in one of the worst world title matches of all time, Diesel versus the British Bulldog for the Winged Eagle. Hell, so bad would this main event be, once it was over, Vince McMahon would be seen to throw down his headset and leave the commentary booth talking about how terrible it was. Unsurprisingly then, this marked the end of the Kevin Nash experiment in WWF, as by the time In Your House 5 Seasons Beatings happened on December 17th of that same year, it would be Bret Hart who had the gold around his waist as he went on to have a title defense against Davey Boy Smith, which has gone far too forgotten in favor of their much more famous match at Wembley Stadium in 1992. What else was happening in Your House 5? Not a lot, because in keeping with the tradition of the show by now, outside of the odd hidden classic here and there, it was all very mid. Seriously, this was the show where an evil Santa named Xanta Claus, one played by Balls Mahoney, was brought out to the ring by the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase. And as if that weren't bad enough, it was also the site of that infamous Arkansas hog pen bout between Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Henry O. Godwin, the one that saw the game somehow avoid a serious infection after rolling around in pig swill and mud with a giant gash running down his back. Again though, while the shows themselves were pretty weak, they were continuing to bring in some extra cash for WWF. And that would continue to be the case for In Your House 6 Rage in the Cage on February 18th, 1996. Of course, this one was a better show in general, arguably the first well-received In Your House show overall, as well as Razor Ramon and the 1-2-3 Kid overcoming a terrible crybaby match gimmick to have a pretty good showing, and Shawn Michaels and Owen Hart tearing it up, the televised main event would see Bret Hart and Diesel have an underrated steel cage bout for the WWF title, one which ended with The Undertaker bursting through the ring in order to set up his match with Kevin Nash at WrestleMania 12 the following month. Sadly though, this would not mark the start of a complete turnaround in fortunes for In Your House as a concept. No, by the time In Your House 7 Good Friends Better Enemies happened on April 28, 1996, aside from a decent main event pitting new WWF champion Shawn Michaels against Diesel in what turned out to be Kevin Nash's last match with the company before he left for WCW, there wouldn't be much to write home about here. Sure, there would be a pair of good dark matches in which the ringmaster Steve Austin faced off against Savio Vega and The Undertaker and Mankind went one-on-one. But if you were watching on pay-per-view and not there live, you wouldn't have gotten a chance to see these. And that stung all the more as by now Vince McMahon had upped the price of these shows to $20 in a continued effort to keep his head above water in the face of looming bankruptcy. Of course, any hopes the boss had of making money off of In Your House 8 Beware of Dog when that aired on May 26, 1996 would have to be thrown out of the window though. Why was that? Well, because this was the show where, in a complete disaster of a situation, a thunderstorm would cause power to be cut from the arena mid-show, meaning that a significant portion of it never got to air on pay-per-view. So as a result of this, refunds would have to be handed out to everyone who purchased the event, and on top of that, a second attempt at the show would have to be run 2 days later, with all of this incurring extra costs for WWF right when they needed it the least. Really then, while there were some good elements to this show, most notably the Caribbean strap match between Steve Austin and Savio Vega, all of that is completely overshadowed now as all anyone remembers today is that this was the show where the power went out and for a period of time, the wrestlers were quite literally performing dark matches for the live crowd. Could things get any worse for In Your House 9 International Incident on July 21st of that same year? Well, no, in the sense that at least the lights stayed on for the duration of this one. That said, it was still a pretty weak card overall, with matches like Mankind vs. Henry O. Godwin, Steve Austin vs. Mark Marrow, and The Undertaker vs. Goldust only reinforcing the idea that these continued to be shows which could very easily be skipped and nothing would be missed. Thankfully then, by the time In Your House 10 Mind Games aired on September 22, 1996, it felt like a corner had finally been turned when it came to the concept, as this was a show which, while still a couple of rungs below something like a WrestleMania or a SummerSlam, felt a lot more consequential. Why was that? Well, it was here that a good balance was found when it came to having enough stars appearing in big matches for the pay-per-view buying audience. Don't believe us? Just go back and watch it now, and you'll see the likes of The Undertaker and Goldust going at it in a fun final curtain bout, Owen Hart and the British Bulldog having a pretty good tag team title defense against the Smoking Guns, and in the main event of the evening, one of the WWF's best matches of the 90s take place when Shawn Michaels and Mankind absolutely tore the house down during their battle over the WWF title. Yes, there's a reason Mick Foley considered this to be his favorite match for a long time, and that reason is, it's just that good. Obviously then, once it was over, it felt like In Your House had some momentum for the first time in its short history. How would WWF try to maintain this momentum? Well, by having another pretty well-received show on October 20th of that same year, with this one being In Your House 11 Buried Alive. As the subtitle would suggest, the real selling point here was the debut of the Buried Alive match pitting The Undertaker against Mankind. But that wasn't all which made this one stand out. No, there was also a fun bout between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Hunter Hearst Helmsley just 1 month before the Rattlesnake really broke through at the Survivor Series, and if you were in the live crowd, a WWF title defense between incoming champ Shawn Michaels and Goldust. That's right, things were finally on a roll here. And while In Your House 12 It's Time, the show which took place on December 15, 1996, and which featured Bret Hart and Psycho Sid waging war over the WWF title, would not be as well received, by the time we got to In Your House 13 Final Four on February 16, 1997, things would once more be cooking. Why was that? Well, as the proto-version of the Attitude Era began to take hold, WWF would make early waves during what might be its best year ever creatively, when not only would a young Rocky Maivia successfully defend his Intercontinental title against Hunter Hearst Helmsley, but in an absolute barn burner of a main event, the vacant WWF title would be put up for grabs as the Final Four from the prior month's Royal Rumble duked it out in a four corners elimination match. Obviously then, this was a contest which had major storyline implications as it saw Bret Hart eventually beat Steve Austin, The Undertaker, and Vader to win the Winged Eagle for a fourth time. More importantly than that though, it was just an excellent brawl between four performers who were at the top of their game. Hell, if you ever wanted to see how badly WWF missed the boat on Vader, you only have to look at how awesome he was here when he was portrayed as an absolute killer of a man. Unfortunately though, even if this was another in what was now a string of great shows, Vince McMahon's promotion was still in dire straits financially as WCW was lapping it in terms of fan support. Why was that? Well, while the WWF product was clearly the better one here, momentum is something which takes a long time to build. And that momentum WWF was building in the early months of 1997 was still very much in its embryonic stages. So when In Your House 14, Revenge of the Taker came around on April 20th and delivered another very solid show, it still wasn't enough to shift the pendulum away from World Championship Wrestling and back in Vince McMahon's favor. That said, it was a good show nonetheless, but then how could it be anything else when this was the one which saw the Legion of Doom win the tag team titles from Owen Hart and the British Bulldog, Steve Austin and Bret Hart have the rematch from their WrestleMania 13 Classic the month prior, and The Undertaker retain his WWF title against Mankind, in the process refuting Paul Bearer's advances and forcing him to reveal the dead man's darkest secret the next night on Raw, that his long-lost brother Kane was still alive. Hell, In Your House 15, A Cold Day in Hell, a pay-per-view held live from the Richmond Coliseum on May 11th, 1997, would be a very fun show too, with this one featuring such highlights as future tag team partners Mankind and Rocky Maivia facing off, Ken Shamrock having what basically amounted to a shoot fight against Vader, so stiff was it, and Stone Cold Steve Austin getting a shot at The Undertaker's WWF title. But while this was another highlight and a continued example of the quality product WWF was putting out there in 1997, it was nothing compared to what came on July 6th. Why was that? Well, because this was the night that In Your House 16 Canadian Stampede took place, one of the greatest WWE shows of all time, and probably one of the best wrestling shows in general. Sure, the card was small here, with it only having 4 bouts and, for the first time, not a single post-show dark match to be seen, but it was very much a case of quality over quantity, as the undercard would give us showdowns like Hunter Hearst Helmsley vs. Mankind, The Great Sasuke vs. Taka Michinoku, and The Undertaker successfully defended his WWF title against Vader. Of course, the real highlight of the show, however, came in the main event, pitting the Hart Foundation fivesome of Bret Hart, Owen Hart, the British Bulldog, Jim Neidhart, and Brian Pillman against the Team USA collective of Steve Austin, Ken Shamrock, Goldust, and the Legion of Doom. After all, with this show taking place in Calgary, home of the Harts, they were able to walk in as the biggest babyfaces in the world here. Seriously, so loud was the crowd when the Hitman's music hit, you can literally see the hard cam shaking, with this atmosphere going a long way towards making Canadian Stampede one which really has to be seen if you've never seen it before. So much of an A show did it come across as, in fact, it would be starting with Ground Zero In Your House on September 7th of the same year that Vince McMahon chose to drop the numbering and increase the price point to the same amount as the Big 5 pay-per-views. How would that work out for the boss? Very well, as it happened, because with a card which included Brian Pillman vs. Goldust and Shawn Michaels vs. The Undertaker in a first-time ever showdown, this one did very well on pay-per-view in spite of the increased cost, so well in fact that it gave a big financial boost to WWF and saw them creep out of the red at last. Yes, we were now on the verge of the WWF entering its second great boom period, and we'd get a step closer to that at Bad Blood In Your House on October 5th, 1997. That was the show where, not only would Owen Hart win the vacant Intercontinental title from the British Bulldog, but in a match which saw the debut of Kane, The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels would go one-on-one in the first and best iteration of the now staple match type for WWE, Hell in a Cell. Honestly, if you were to list the top 5 WWE bouts of all time, then this one would probably have to be in there somewhere. Such a pleasure was it to watch for the 30 minutes during which it lasted. Could D-Generation X In Your House, the event named after the dominating heel faction which was held live from the Springfield Civic Center in Springfield, Massachusetts on December 7th, 1997, live up to this? Well, no, as that show, well, good as well, was not quite on the same level as what had come a couple of months before. If nothing else, though, it did prove that after the events of the Montreal Screwjob at the Survivor Series in November had initially felt like a death blow for WWF, they were going to not only be able to survive the incident, but thrive in the face of it. And that was partially because by then it was clear they had a new ace in Steve Austin, the man who here defended his Intercontinental title against The Rock, all while elsewhere, new WWF champion Shawn Michaels was putting his gold on the line against Ken Shamrock. Hell, it would be Steve Austin who anchored the next several editions of In Your House throughout the beginning of the boom period in early 1998. It doesn't matter if we're talking about No Way Out of Texas In Your House on February 15th of that year, where he was part of an unsanctioned 8-man tag pitting him, Owen Hart, Cactus Jack, and Chainsaw Charlie against D-Generation X and Savio Vega, or Unforgiven In Your House on April 26th, where he was defending his newly won WWF title against Dude Love. By now, this was very much the Stone Cold Show. That said, it wasn't like the company didn't still have a strong supporting cast around him here, particularly at the latter event that was also the one which featured the Inferno match between The Undertaker and Kane. Would this supporting cast still be as strong for Over the Edge In Your House on May 31st of 1998? Yes, it would, as while the main event here would see Steve Austin run things back with Dude Love in one of the more entertaining bouts of the entire Attitude Era, the undercard would feature the Nation of Domination and D-Generation X going to war, Kane and Vader duking it out in a mask versus mask match, and The Rock successfully defended his Intercontinental title against Farouk. But then to be fair, WWF was so hot by now, they could have put out pretty much anything, and it would have been a hit with fans. Don't believe us? Just look at Fully Loaded In Your House on July 26th of that same year. This show, while being a definite step down from the prior editions, still managed to be a huge hit. Of course, it wasn't like it was a bad show or anything, just that it was more in line with the B shows the series had once represented, what with it featuring a main event pitting Stone Cold and The Undertaker against Kane and Mankind with the tag team titles on the line. Sure, there was also a wacky Hart family dungeon match between Owen Hart and Ken Shamrock, and a 2 out of 3 falls bout in which The Rock battled it out with Triple H over the Intercontinental title. But when it came to the latter, that one would see no clear winner at the end, as it finished with the rare time limit draw in WWE. And to be honest, the same quasi-B-show moniker could also be applied to the next 2 editions of the series as well, Breakdown In Your House on September 27th, and Judgment Day In Your House on October 28th. Why is that? Well, when it came to the former, well, it would feature a pretty good triple threat steel cage match between The Rock, Mankind, and Ken Shamrock, and while it would be main evented by another 3-way pitting Steve Austin, The Undertaker, and Kane against one another with the WWF title on the line, it felt more like a transitional show to get us to Survivor Series than anything else, especially as it ended with the top prize being held up as vacant after both of the Brothers of Destruction got the winning pinfall at the same time. And the same could be said about the latter event too, as the only real moment of note on that show would be the main event between The Undertaker and Kane for the vacant WWF title, the one in which, once again, a winner couldn't be determined. Honestly, at this point, it was starting to feel like the In Your House concept was becoming a little played out, because while the shows were a lot stronger now than they had been in their early days, they were very much back to being B shows again, and B shows which didn't need the branding anymore. Hell, that branding was barely even featured at all come the end of 1998. And this would be even clearer at Rock Bottom In Your House on December 13th of that year, as, at that show, which featured The Rock defending his newly won WWF title against Mankind and Stone Cold Steve Austin duking it out with The Undertaker in the return of the Buried Alive match, the talk was more about the fact the show had been named after the Great One than the fact that it was an In Your House event. So it was then that by the time St. Valentine's Day Massacre In Your House came around on February 14th of 1999, the decision had already been made that this would be the last one to feature the In Your House branding. Yes, following on from here, all non-Big 5 shows would drop the subtitle and simply be known as things like Backlash and Unforgiven. Would the concept be able to go out with a bang during this last go-around? Thankfully it would, because at St. Valentine's Day Massacre, fans would be treated to not just a world title match between The Rock and Mankind, but also the long-awaited singles bout between Steve Austin and Vince McMahon inside of a steel cage, with the latter leading to the introduction of The Big Show in WWF. After that, though, it really was over for In Your House, and for a long time following, it seemed like it was never going to return. But this would all change in 2020 because it was here that, as part of their TakeOver series, NXT revived the whole thing once more. That's right, it would be on May 13th of this year that TakeOver In Your House aired, and in between nostalgic segments like Adam Cole appearing in a parody of an old Ico Pro commercial, the in-ring action would include highlights such as Keith Lee and Johnny Gargano going one-on-one for the North American title, and Io Shirai winning the NXT Women's title during her triple threat match pitting her against both Rhea Ripley and Charlotte Flair. So successful would this one end up being, in fact, it would lead to a second version happening on June 13th, 2021, with things this time seeing LA Knight win the $1 million title during a ladder match with Cameron Grimes, Raquel Gonzalez successfully defend her NXT Women's title against Ember Moon, and Karrion Kross win the NXT World title during a 5-way contest, which also featured Adam Cole, Kyle O'Reilly, Johnny Gargano, and Pete Dunne. Hell, there would actually be a third incarnation of NXT in your house, which happened on June 4th, 2022, though by that point the TakeOver title would have been dropped as the Black and Gold brand had shifted towards its 2.0 incarnation. At this show, the main bouts on the card would be Carmelo Hayes beating Cameron Grimes for the North American title, Mandy Rose successfully defending her NXT Women's title against Wendy Chu, and Braun Breaker doing the same with his NXT World title against Joe Gacy. Once that event drew to a close, however, it really was time up for In Your House, as this would be the last time the branding has been used as of the time of this video's recording. Could it see a return again in the future, possibly as another NXT special? That seems fairly likely, so it may be that In Your House isn't done forever quite yet, but even if it isn't, what it was when it first began has now evolved to the point that those early shows are a thing of the past. That said, they remain an important part of WWE's history anyway, one which helped them to stay afloat during the darkest times and eventually transform into the powerhouse that they are today. Throughout WWE's long history, the number one prize has always been the world title. And that statement, depending on what brand you're on at any given moment, can apply to either the WWE title, the World Heavyweight title, or even the relatively short-lived Universal title. But what of secondary gold? The belt that's generally saved for those who are on the rise and want to signal that they've finally arrived as a star of the future. Well, it's one of those belts we're going to look at now, probably the most important one in WWE as it happens. So join us as we take a deep dive into the entire history of the Intercontinental title. It all started in 1979. That was the year when Vince McMahon Sr.'s Worldwide Wrestling Federation decided that, after spending the first decade or so of their existence cycling through various mid-card belts like the WWF United States Heavyweight Championship, the WWF International Heavyweight Championship, and the WWF Junior Heavyweight Champion, it would finally settle on one for the long haul. What would this belt be called? Well, it would be called the WWF Intercontinental Heavyweight Championship, with it gaining this name on account of the fact it represented the unification of two prior pieces of gold, one real and one fictional. Yes, back in the autumn of '79, then WWF North American Heavyweight Champion Pat Patterson challenged the mysterious WWF South American Heavyweight Champion during the finals of a special one-night tournament held in Rio de Janeiro, with him winning this to call himself the first ever Intercontinental Heavyweight Champion. Of course, as it's known by most wrestling fans now though, that tournament never actually happened and there never was a South American title. No, the whole thing had been made up to offer a kayfabe explanation as to why this new prize suddenly was appearing at shows. How did Vince McMahon Sr. get away with doing this without anyone knowing about it at the time? Well, because back then you didn't have things like the internet in order to tell you all about what was happening around the world at any given moment. What would happen now that the Intercontinental Heavyweight Championship had been established? Well, it would quickly find itself ending up around the waist of some of the most talented mid-card acts in the company, as after Patterson dropped it in April of 1980, it would spend the next 3 years going between Ken Patera, Pedro Morales, and Don Morocco. And that was only the start, because by the time Vince McMahon Jr. took over the promotion during the early 80s, it would be on the verge of reaching a whole new level of prestige. Why was this? Well, at that point, the WWF World title was going to spend the better part of the next decade being dominated by the likes of Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. Very over acts as far as star power went, but not people who were ever going to be accused of being spectacular in-ring talents. Now, if you were a high work rate guy, then the belt for you inside of the WWF system was going to be the Intercontinental title. And that's what led to Tito Santana and Greg the Hammer Valentine winning it in 1984 and 1985 respectively, with them here beginning the process of turning it into the prize that would guarantee the best wrestling match on the show. That said, what they would do would be nothing compared to what came next, as it would be on February 8th of 1986 at a live event in Boston that the man who, to this day, might be the most commonly associated with the prize would win it. That's right, this was the night that the Macho Man Randy Savage fully arrived in Vince McMahon's promotion by taking the belt off of the Hammer. And for the next year then, he'd go on a superb run with it, almost always stealing the show on whatever card he was on. Really, such a good job did Savage do here. He'd take the Intercontinental title to a level that, on the house shows in which Hogan wasn't there, it could easily main event and draw in a great crowd in the process. And it's a reputation which would only grow stronger after WrestleMania 3, as this was the show, in front of what was at the time the biggest live attendance any wrestling show had ever seen by a country mile. The Macho Man and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat would put on an absolute clinic, which for many people completely stole the show right out from under the main event of Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. So it shouldn't be a surprise to learn then that many of the people who would lace up their own boots and years later cite this as the moment which inspired them to do so. And that created a situation where, once many of these performers did finally hit a WWF ring, it wasn't the world title they dreamed about winning. Rather, it was the Intercontinental title they wanted, as that was the one which had the reputation of being the prize which the real wrestlers held. Sure, the WWF title had all the prestige, and it was surrounded by the glitz and glamour which came with that, but the Intercontinental strap, well, that was different. If you won that belt, then it proved that you could hang with the best actual wrestlers. And as the 80s went on, it would continue to build on its growing importance in the pecking order. When once Ricky Steamboat had his all-too-short run following his victory over Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3, it would spend the rest of the decade being further elevated even higher up the card. Sure, the next two champions, the Honky Tonk Man and the Ultimate Warrior, wouldn't be exactly what you'd call heavy work rate guys. But in the case of the former, what he was able to do was to take the belt a level above, as over the course of the 453 days he held it, he'd take on all comers, with many of his challengers being main event level guys. That said, no matter who tried to relieve Wayne Ferris of his gold, he'd always be able to squeak out a sneaky win come the end of the night. That was until he met the Ultimate Warrior, of course, as it would be at SummerSlam in August of 1988 that Jim Hellwig finally ended the champ's reign during a 31-second squash. Obviously then, this was a big deal for the legacy of the IC strap, as by the late 80s, the Warrior was skyrocketing in popularity so much he was actually starting to approach the level of Hulk Hogan. So at that point, there began being questions about who the real top dog was and which belt was the most important as a result. And this would all lead to a situation where, after he briefly dropped the gold to Rick Rude and then won it back again, Jim Hellwig would head into WrestleMania 6 preparing to go one-on-one with the Hulkster in a first-time ever winner-take-all title-for-title match. That's right, the big question at WrestleMania in April of 1990 was which champion was going to be standing tall come the end of the evening. And to the surprise of some, that winner would end up being the Intercontinental Champion, the Ultimate Warrior, with this briefly unifying both men's singles prizes in WWF at the time. Unfortunately though, in the weeks following WrestleMania 6, on-screen WWF President Jack Tunney would formally decide that no one man could keep up the duties of being both World and Intercontinental Champions at the same time. And so this was why Hellwig would be forced to vacate the latter with immediate effect here. Who won the belt during the subsequent tournament to find a new one? Well, that would be Mr. Perfect. And this would begin the process of turning the IC strap into the true work rate prize once again. As with the golden era now coming to a slow end, and the new generation era not far off, the next few years would see the mid-card gold go to a whole new host of acts like the Texas Tornado, the Mountie, and of course, Bret Hitman Hart. Yes, if Randy Savage was the man most commonly associated with the mid-card title during the golden era, then Bret Hart was probably the guy who would most become closely associated with it for the decade after, as he was able to infuse it with a level of in-ring skill which was another level up yet again from what anyone else had been able to do before. But then when you're the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be, it's a lot easier to take things to new heights. Hell, it would be the Hitman who would be right there front and center when, in the summer of 1992, the Intercontinental title reached what may very well be its highest watermark to date when he defended it against British Bulldog at that year's SummerSlam. That's right, with this pay-per-view taking place in the UK, it was decided that a hometown hero was needed for the closer. And so that was why, while the Macho Man and the Ultimate Warrior were fighting over the WWF title in the semi-main, the Hitman and Davey Boy Smith would be the ones going on last for the benefit of the live crowd. Needless to say then, by the time this one was over, it would be the Manchester native holding the gold around his waist. Sadly, however, the British Bulldog would not get a lengthy run after that, as mere months later it would bounce over to Shawn Michaels when the Englishman was abruptly fired in the wake of the steroid scandal. But at least there was a silver lining to this, and that was that Shawn Michaels was now the champion, because if there was anyone who could challenge Bret Hart's claim of being the best person to hold that title during the early to mid-90s, it would be the Heartbreak Kid. Come on now, it would be Shawn who would give us yet another high point for the Intercontinental strap when, at WrestleMania 10, he and Razor Ramon forever changed the game with their iconic ladder match, another one of the best matches in WWE's history. That's right, if it wasn't already clear by then, after WrestleMania 10 it was obvious for all to see that the best wrestling in WWF happened in the Intercontinental title division. And as the 90s progressed further, other high-level wrestlers would try to add to that growing legacy of the mid-card gold by having their own runs with it. We're talking about names like Marty Jannetty, Diesel, Jeff Jarrett, and Scott Hall himself. Sure, not every champion here would be a hit, as was the case with Dean Douglas, Mark Merrow, or Ahmed Johnson, but for every one of them there was a Goldust, a Hunter Hearst Helmsley, or an Owen Hart. And then of course, there were two men who would soon go on to become the biggest stars in the entire industry, Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. Yes, while it's easy to look back on the feud between the Rattlesnake and the People's Champion as being a mostly main event one which centered around the world title, it actually began in 1997 when each wanted possession of the Intercontinental belt. Hell, so much would Austin covet the IC strap here, he'd quite literally fight his way through a broken neck at SummerSlam 1997 in order to win it. And this led to some great moments throughout the remainder of that year as he continued his rise up the card. Come 1998, however, Stone Cold would very much be the guy on top with the WWF title around his waist. And so it was then that the major Intercontinental title feud of that year would be The Rock doing everything he could to fend off the challenge of Triple H. How would this go? Well, it would mark another high point for the belt, as it would be at SummerSlam 1998 that, once again, the Intercontinental belt arguably stole the show during the ladder match between the Great One and the Game. But after Triple H had to quickly vacate the belt he won on the night as a result of an injury, it would also mark the beginning of the downfall in many ways. Why was that? Well, as the Attitude Era entered full swing, title changes started happening a lot more rapidly, and what this meant for the mid-card prize was that it would end up bouncing around a lot more amongst people who probably wouldn't have gotten a look with it during times prior. Sure, part of this was because the Attitude Era was a much less work rate focused era, with it instead relying more on the appeal of crazy storylines and Crash TV. But even if you take that into account, the likes of Road Dogg, Val Venus, and The Godfather calling themselves Intercontinental Champion during this period created a sense that the best days might be behind the once mighty prize. Sure, there would still be some solid performers who got a hold of it, performers like Ken Shamrock, Edge, and D'Lo Brown. But come late 1999, it felt like things might be on the verge of hitting a new low they were not going to be able to recover from. And then something happened to give some new life to the IC strap. In October of that year, for the first and to date only time ever, a woman won a men's singles belt in WWF. Of course, this was no normal woman though, rather it was the ninth wonder of the world in China. And with her making history here, it managed to give a second win to the struggling piece of gold, as from there, it had a bit of a resurgence during 2000 and 2001 when it was won by some of the best wrestlers on the planet again. We're talking about names like Chris Jericho, Kurt Angle, and Eddie Guerrero here. Again though, it wasn't like everything was perfect during the second half of the Attitude Era. No, there would be some less successful champs in there too, such as Billy Gunn and an otherwise very over Rikishi. But there was a general feeling that a corner had been turned. But alas, this second wind was not meant to last forever, as by the time 2002 arrived and the brand split was about to begin, it wasn't uncommon to see this once mighty piece of hardware bounce around in relevancy once more. So bad did things get here after a while, in fact. It would be in October of 2002 that once the belt had become a Raw exclusive following the first draft, WWE would make the decision to unify it with the European, Hardcore, and World titles, meaning that for a while, the last official champion was Triple H. Thankfully though, after realizing the error of his ways, Vince McMahon ultimately chose to bring the belt back less than a year later, with it being in May of 2003 that an all-new champ was crowned in the form of Christian. That said, even if this was good news for fans of the Intercontinental title, those good vibes would not last for long because despite there still being some high-level talent who held the belt in the years following, its booking would often be so lackluster it became hard to care about it at all. Sure, there were some highlights for the belt here. Highlights such as Randy Orton's excellent runs with it in late 2003 and early 2004, the same run which gave us his excellent street fight against Mick Foley at the latter year's Backlash. But really, even if the talent pool in the division remained high, the overall presentation of the belt just brought it down to such a low level. And that was how names like Shelton Benjamin, Johnny Nitro, Carlito, and even Ric Flair, people who would have made for great IC champs in decades prior, ended up flopping during their runs for the most part. Really, outside of that aforementioned Randy Orton run, one of the only times when the mid-card strap got any kind of real story during the 2010s was when Santino Marella won it, and from there went on a journey to try and beat Honky Tonk Man's then record single reign of 453 days. But even that angle was snuffed out way before it should have been, as Vince McMahon presumably got bored of the whole thing. Where would this leave things as the decade came to an end? Well, while there were continued attempts to raise the stock of the prize once more via names like CM Punk, JBL, and Rey Mysterio, they'd all eventually meet the same fate as Santino, as they'd never be able to get anything to work with for long enough to build the required momentum. What the Intercontinental title needed desperately at this point was a change which would eventually come when, following the 2009 draft, it was moved over to Smackdown full-time. Would this breathe some much-needed new life into the once great prize? Well, additional attempts would certainly be made here, but ultimately all of those attempts would be in vain, just as they had been over on Raw, with the reason for this being it never felt like the booking team cared about the division. Still, even if this was the case, there were plenty of acts here that would later go on to become main event stars, so there was still an element of the strap representing the future of the company, even at this low point in history. Yes, as the 2010s got going, names like Drew McIntyre, Wade Barrett, and Cody Rhodes would all have their first runs with the gold. And in Cody's case, he'd even be able to bring a smidgen of the old feeling back to Macho Man's title when he convinced WWE to return to the classic white strap design from the late 80s and early 90s. But it wasn't like everyone who held the IC belt during this period would be on a path toward the top. No, some would never get there, as was the case with Ezekiel Jackson and Curtis Axel. And others would be on their way down from a prior main event run already, as happened when the Big Show became champ in April of 2012. Was there anyone who was able to build enough momentum with the gold here that they could be associated with it going forward, as people like Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Razor Ramon had done in the past? Yeah, to an extent. After all, when people think of the IC title today, The Miz is often one of the past champions that come to mind, with this largely being on account of the fact that after he first won it during Raw 1000 on July 23, 2012, he'd go on to win it a further 7 times down the line. Of course, that's not the record though. No, after continuing to rack up additional reigns throughout the 2010s, Chris Jericho would set the high watermark himself when he became a 9-time Intercontinental Champion, a number which still has never been beaten to this day. But even if Jericho was setting records here, it still wasn't enough to restore any real prestige to the Intercontinental title, because again, the booking of it left fans with little reason to care. And that remained the case even as a new era of stars entered the fray and got their own go-arounds with it. But no matter how many good matches they were able to have, things always returned to that status quo of the belt being little more than a prop. Hell, the infamously bad Elimination Chamber bout where Ryback won the gold for the first and only time in May of 2015 might have been a low point for the Intercontinental title overall. But even in the midst of this, there was a little glimmer of sunshine to be found, and that glimmer would occur at WrestleMania 32, as this was the event where, for one night only, Zack Ryder got his moment when he won a ladder match in order to take the belt home. Of course, once that was done though, it would be right back to the dark days again, as with the reinstitution of the brand split, the belt spent a short period being Smackdown exclusive before it was bounced back over to Raw a year later. As you would expect at this point then, this subsequent run on Raw only further devalued the once mighty prize, right? Well, not exactly. No, while it was still booked pretty poorly overall and was nowhere near the heights it had been during the 80s and 90s, there was a bit of a mini renaissance for the Intercontinental title here, as it would be held by the likes of Bobby Lashley, Finn Balor, Roman Reigns, and Seth Rollins, with Rollins in particular doing a pretty good job of adding some prestige to the gold with his bouts against opponents such as Dolph Ziggler. Yes, for the first time in a long time, it felt like the secondary strap had a little bit of momentum again. Unfortunately though, once it was moved back over to SmackDown in 2019, that momentum would quickly disappear. And the reason for this was because, despite high-level acts like Shinsuke Nakamura, Sami Zayn, and AJ Styles holding it here, it was once again a victim of bad booking and overall presentation. Would this signal the final death knell of the Intercontinental title? Well, for a while it looked like it, because the subsequent runs of Braun Strowman, Apollo Crews, and Ricochet here only further entrenched it in the fog of the mid-card. And then something happened. Something which would, after all of these years, finally turn around the fortunes of one of WWE's oldest and most celebrated pieces of hardware all over again. What would this be? Well, in June of 2022, Gunther would win the belt from Ricochet. And with this concluding with Vince McMahon being ousted from the company for the first time and Triple H taking over the book then, it meant the Austrian got a proper run with it. one which allowed him to fully dominate every opponent he went up against for almost 2 full years thereafter. That's right, by the time his reign was over, the former NXT UK champion had completely turned the fortunes of the Intercontinental title around and made it seem like something which was important again. Important enough that when he moved on to something else, that something else was immediately the world title picture. Of course, part of the reason Gunther's reign is so highly regarded today isn't just the great matches he was having, or the fact that the belt was being booked like an actual prize worthy of holding again. No, it's also the fact that he'd be the one to finally break the Honky Tonk Man's record, with the Vienna Native's run ultimately ending at 666 days. And once he dropped it to Sami Zayn, subsequent champions would do their best to keep this reinvigorated momentum for the second piece of gold going into the mid-2020s. No, it wasn't like it was suddenly back up on the level it had been during the 80s or mid-90s when it was truly at its peak, but this was pretty damn close to that, and a hell of a lot closer than anyone thought they'd ever get to see the IC strap get to again. Yes, with recent years seeing soon-to-be main event stars like Jey Uso, future top guys in Braun Breaker and current champ Dominic Mysterio holding the gold, it felt like a true renaissance for the mid-card in WWE. But then how could it be anything other than that when we're now seeing the Intercontinental title once more be used to elevate the future, all while providing us with some of the better matches in the company, just as it had done decades ago? After all, more than anything else, that's what this belt represents. Not the glitz and glamour of the main event, but the graft that goes into getting to that level one day. And that's why it'll always be the prize of the wrestlers out there, the ones who wanted to steal the show rather than necessarily main event it. Where will it go in the future? Well, now that it's had such a great late-stage revival, the sky really is the limit. Who knows? Maybe before all is said and done, it'll once again fully reach the level of those peak years again. It's certainly not that far off from doing so, and if it does, it'll be a testament to just how valuable the belt is in the eyes of fans, as even during its darkest years, they never gave up on WWE's workhorse prize. Long before Raw or Smackdown came along, television in WWE was saved for shows like Superstars, shows which mostly featured quick squash matches. So if you wanted to see those big main events then, you either had to attend your local house show or watch something like WrestleMania. But then something happened, as it would be in May of 1985 that Vince McMahon and Dick Ebersol started running an all-new endeavor, a TV special which aired periodically on NBC and which would feature star versus star bouts on the regular. And it's this show we're going to be looking at right now, so join us as we take a deep dive into its entire legacy in the history of Saturday night's main event. It all starts, as we mentioned a moment ago, in the spring of 1985. This was when, seeing how much success WWF was having in the pop culture world following things like WrestleMania 1 and the MTV special The War to Settle the Score, then head of NBC Dick Ebersol met with Vince McMahon to discuss airing a pro wrestling event on his own network. Of course, if that was going to happen though, it couldn't be the same kind of content that was being put out on shows like Superstars. No, like with The War to Settle the Score, this show would have to feature big-time matches worthy of pay-per-view. Now, we should take a moment here to explain why this was such a novel thing during the mid-80s, as today the idea of stars showing up and having matches on TV every week is such a regular thing. Hell, it's not uncommon to see someone like a Cody Rhodes or a CM Punk have a title defense on either Raw or Smackdown. Back in the early days of the Golden Era, however, the wrestling business was built on a different foundation, as with this being before the era of big money TV deals which has seen WWE become so successful in 2026, the real money here was made on the house show circuit. Yes, selling tickets to live events was the primary driver of income in the pre-WrestleMania days. And so, whenever TV shows like Superstars aired, they'd mostly be used to build up matches which would later take place at live events. Following the success of WrestleMania 1 though, the game changed, and now TV executives could see the money there was to be made in getting those same fans to watch a big wrestling show on their network in large numbers instead. And thankfully, McMahon was happy to go along with that idea, as he knew getting his product on NBC would be a great way to reach an even bigger audience than before. So it was then that on May 11th of that year, in a time slot usually saved for reruns of Saturday Night Live, the first episode of Saturday Night's Main Event would air. And as was promised, this show would feature some marquee matches. What would some of these be? Well, aside from Wendy Richter defending her WWF Women's title against the Fabulous Moolah, Hulk Hogan would appear to put his own world title on the line against Cowboy Bob Orton. Needless to say then, this was a very big deal for fans, as it gave them access to the kind of bouts they'd never have seen on free television before. And NBC would be very happy with the show too as it happened, because Saturday night's main event would score a pretty great 8.8 rating by the time all was said and done, with this making it a given that the concept would be repeated. That's right, very quickly now, an industry which had been built upon putting butts in seats in arenas was being forced to adapt to this new business model. But WWF, by now pretty much being the only game in town in North America, was in a perfect place to adapt to this change, as with many members of their roster now becoming household names, they were able to draw these TV audiences in and reap the financial rewards that came with that. Of course, it wasn't just the star versus star matches which made the first Saturday night's main event a success though. No, these wouldn't have been nearly effective if there wasn't a strong overall presentation to the whole show as well. Luckily then, Saturday night's main event had just this, as with Vince McMahon and Jesse the Body Ventura on commentary and the now iconic Obsession track being used as an intro song, the whole thing felt major league in every possible way. Really, the only question was, would the second edition be able to match the same levels of success, or would the novelty wear off after the initial episode? This was certainly a concern some in WWF had, but in the end, they needn't have been concerned because when the sequel happened on October 5th of that same year, it would be just as big of a hit. That said, it should have been, because not only would Hulk Hogan appear again here to defend his world title against Nikolai Volkov in a flag match, but viewers tuning in would also get to see Rowdy Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff go one-on-one. The Dream Team put their tag team titles up for grabs against Lanny Poffo and Tony Garea, and Andre the Giant team up with Tony Atlas to defeat King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd. Then of course there was the wedding ceremony of Uncle Elmer and Joyce Stasco, a shoot segment, and the first time a wedding had been done on WWF television. As you would expect then, the message here was clear. If you tuned in to Saturday night's main event in the future, you were not only going to see big-time matches given away on free TV, you were also going to get major segments which advanced key storylines. Yes, this was Monday Night Raw almost a decade before Monday Night Raw existed, and the third edition on November 2nd of 1985 would continue to prove that there was an audience hungry for a show like this, as that one drew another strong rating for NBC. What was the card for that show? Well, Hulk Hogan would appear again here, though this time he would not be defending his WWF title. No, instead he'd be teaming up with Andre the Giant to take on King Kong Bundy and Big John Studd. That said, this would be more than enough to satisfy viewers, as just seeing the Hulkster wrestle on television at all was still a huge novelty back in 1985. That's right, even more so than the Macho Man Randy Savage's Intercontinental title defense against Tito Santana here, or the Terry Funk showdown against the Junkyard Dog, it was Terry Bollea who was the real draw of Saturday night's main event. And this meant he'd always have a featured role on the show whenever a new episode aired. Hell, as 1985 bled into 1986, there would be no one who wrestling fans were more interested in seeing on NBC. So when Saturday night's main event's 4th and 5th editions aired on January 4th and March 1st of the latter year, Hogan's WWF title defenses against Terry Funk and Don Morocco would continue to be the highest rated segments by far. Of course, you would expect these segments to always be the main event ones then, right? Well, if you thought that, you'd be wrong, because often the Hulkster would appear in the first hour here, with the logic being that kids would get a better chance to watch him this way before they went to bed. That's right, like with shows such as Raw or Dynamite in 2025, the last hour of Saturday night's main event often didn't feature the biggest bouts. Still, for those who were staying up late enough to watch, some popular acts would be saved for these quarters. We are talking about acts like Ricky Steamboat and Randy Savage here. And those segments would continue to feature major storyline progression, even if some of the children in the audience weren't able to stay up long enough to see it, with this being particularly true by the 5th edition of the show, as by then the build to WrestleMania 2 was happening. Clearly then, there was no stopping what Vince McMahon and Dick Ebersol had created here. No, all it ever seemed to do was go from strength to strength, as with each passing month, WWF became that much more of a pop culture phenomenon. Seriously, by the time the 6th, 7th, and 8th iterations of Saturday night's main event happened on March 1st, May 3rd, and October 4th of 1986, it felt like this was an idea that might just go on forever. But then, how could it not feel that way when such iconic moments as Hulk Hogan debuting his Real American theme would happen here? And not just that, no, there were also very violent angles for the time period, like the time Jake Roberts DDT'd Ricky Steamboat onto the concrete floor outside of the ring and legitimately sent him to the emergency room. Would the momentum both WWF and NBC had built here be able to continue on into 1987? Absolutely, as in many ways, that year would prove to be the most successful yet, with the March 14th edition of the show drawing a whopping 11.6 rating, to this day the highest rating any show has ever done in that time slot on that channel. To put this in perspective, these days, episodes of Smackdown can expect to draw somewhere in the 0.26 range, a far cry from where we were back in the mid to late 80s. Sure, part of that is because TV is a very different animal now, and with cord cutting happening at an alarming rate, even the viewerships that Raw and Dynamite get today are pretty good when put in comparison to what shows like Raw and Nitro were getting in the 90s. That said, as Scott Steiner once famously said, the numbers don't lie, and even with more people having cable back in 1987, and there not being things like streaming services to siphon viewers away, what Saturday Night's Main Event did here was hugely impressive. Really, they're a testament to just how hot the promotion was during the peaks of the golden era. So by now, seeing that this was the better business model going forward, Vince McMahon decided to give even more big matches away on the show rather than save them for the house show circuit, as he did when he had Hulk Hogan defend his WWF title against Paul Orndorff inside of a steel cage on Saturday Night's Main Event 9. And when he wasn't doing that, he was airing things like lumberjack matches pitting the Macho Man against George the Animal Steele, that or interview segments between the Hulkster and Andre the Giant designed to hype up their big WrestleMania 3 showdown. Really, by the time Saturday Night's Main Event 13 went on air on November 28th of 1987 live from a packed-out Seattle Center Coliseum, there was little the boss wasn't willing to blow off on television. Sure, pay-per-view would still feature the biggest matches, but by now, television was only a step below that in terms of overall importance. Think it couldn't get any bigger from here? Think again. Because not only would 1988 see the Mega Powers start to become a combined force on episodes of Saturday Night's Main Event, but the ongoing Hulk Hogan-Andre the Giant feud would also continue to be a hugely focused upon angle. So much focus would this get, in fact, after Andre attacked the Hulkster following his WWF title defense against King Kong Bundy on the January 2nd edition of the show that year, a spin-off would be created to contain the rematch of the century between the pair. Yes, it would be on February 5th, 1988 that Dick Ebersol gave Vince McMahon a second show on NBC, known simply as the Main Event. Obviously then, with this one being main evented by Hogan-Andre 2, the much anticipated second round from WrestleMania 3, it was expected that a very large audience would be tuning in. That said, no one could have predicted just how large an audience would be doing this, as in the end, a staggering 33 million fans watched on that evening as the Giant and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase executed a dastardly plan to get the WWF title off of Hulk Hogan through the use of plastic surgery and a crooked referee played by Earl Hebner. Really, the only other thing that gets numbers like this is the Super Bowl. So it should come as no surprise to learn that, even now in 2026, the Main Event holds the record for the largest TV audience any wrestling show has ever had. And while subsequent episodes of Saturday Night's Main Event throughout the remainder of 1988 would not be able to come anywhere close to those numbers, it would still continue to do very well overall, as in the lead up to and during aftermath of WrestleMania 4, fan interest remained at a high, especially when Randy Savage came out of that pay-per-view the new WWF champion. That's right, while he never got to defend the world title on pay-per-view during his first year-long run as champ, the Macho Man would get to make several big defenses on NBC, with some of the most notable of these being his bouts against One Man Gang and Andre the Giant. Even then though, the real star of the show remained Hulk Hogan, world title or no world title. And this was made clear when one of the rare editions of Saturday Night's Main Event he missed, the 16th episode, would score some of the lowest ratings for the concept overall. Not that they were bad, of course. No, WWF was still too hot and Randy Savage was far too popular for that to be the case. But it was clear that things were always that much stronger whenever Terry Bollea was there. And this was probably a big part of the reason why, in the lead up to WrestleMania 5, he'd once more become the #1 contender to the world title. That said, in doing so, he'd have to break the hearts of many fans because this would be where the Mega Powers would famously explode. Not that such a disaster would happen all at once, however. No, there would be plenty of teasing during the late months of 1988 and the early months of 1989 before the fall finally came. And one of the most notable of these teases would occur during the Saturday Night's Main Event 19 on January 4th of the latter year, the night where, as the twin towers of the Big Boss Man and Akeem were beating down the Hulkster in the middle of the ring, the Macho Man neglected to run in and save his partner, as he was more concerned with questioning Miss Elizabeth about his concerns that Hogan had lust in his eyes for the valet. Obviously then, it was only going to be a matter of time until things boiled over completely here. And that boiling over would eventually happen on the second edition of the Main Event on February 3rd, 1989, when Savage turned heel on the #1 contender to his title. Yes, once again, one of the biggest angles in WWF's history had happened on the Saturday Night's Main Event brand. Sure, the big blow-off would once more be saved for pay-per-view, with the Hogan-Savage one-on-one bout happening at WrestleMania 5 soon thereafter. But if you hadn't been watching the NBC specials in the lead-up to this, then you wouldn't have been anywhere near as invested in that blow-off, as you would have missed out on so much of the story. Would Saturday Night's Main Event remain strong following the high watermark of the Mega Powers explosion? Yes, it would. In fact, all throughout the remainder of 1989, TV ratings for the show would continue to be high. And part of the reason for this was because now, with Terry Bollea in possession of the WWF title once more after he'd been able to dethrone the Macho Man at the Showcase of the Immortals, he could have further big defenses, just as he had during the early days of the show, this time against opponents such as the Big Boss Man, the Honky Tonk Man, and Ted DiBiase, all while the rest of the card was being rounded out by things like routinely excellent Brainbusters tag team title defenses, Rick Rude's run as Intercontinental Champion, and the rapid rise of a new superstar in the Ultimate Warrior. Unfortunately though, as 1990 dawned, the first cracks in the armor of Saturday Night's Main Event would show themselves, as while the January 27th edition that year did remain strong in terms of TV viewership, once the Warrior beat Hulk Hogan for the WWF title at WrestleMania 6 in April, it almost immediately became clear things were cooling off. Why was that? Well, while he certainly was over with the audience, when it came down to it, Jim Hellwig just couldn't draw on the same level as the Hulkster. And as if that wasn't bad enough, even the former champ's star power was now starting to show the first signs of waning, as a portion of the fan base began getting a little tired of seeing the same old shtick they'd been watching from him since 1984. Sure, things wouldn't exactly crater here or anything, at least not right away. But like with WWE in 2001, there was a sense that the peak had come and gone, and now things were on a slow but sure downward trajectory. Hell, even big bouts like Hogan vs. Mr. Perfect and the Ultimate Warrior vs. Rick Rude inside of a steel cage for the WWF title couldn't do enough to paper over the cracks. And things only got worse once the company began a highly questionable angle in which Sergeant Slaughter became an Iraqi sympathizer right as the Gulf War was about to start, with all this leading to a situation where the April 27, 1991 edition of the show would be the last one which aired on NBC before it was canceled in favor of the NBA. Thankfully though, this would not be the complete end of Saturday Night's Main Event, as the Fox network, still seeing some value in it, would pick it up in January of 1992. But alas, despite getting a second chance here, it was not meant to be that the concept would survive for much longer. No, after only 2 episodes on this new network, Saturday Night's Main Event would be dropped for a second time. And that, as it turned out, would be the last time it was heard of for almost 2.5 decades. As we all know now though, it was not the last time it was heard of forever. No, it would be in 2006 that after Monday Night Raw returned to the USA Network, a network which was owned by the same conglomerate as NBC, NBC made a deal with Vince McMahon to bring back the once popular show from the 80s. That said, this time things were not going to be the same as they had been before, because by now Raw and Smackdown had long since made the idea of stars fighting on TV regularly a common occurrence. Hell, the idea that weekly television could be anything less than this felt like something which would have been outright rejected by the audience. So for that reason then, the concept of Saturday Night's Main Event didn't have the same hook it had before. How would WWE counteract this in order to make it feel special for a mid-2000s audience? Well, not a lot as it happened. No, while there was some pomp and circumstance surrounding the debut episode of The Revival on March 18th of that year, it just didn't hit the way it had in prior decades. And the reason for this was because, while seeing main eventers like John Cena and Triple H team up to take on Kurt Angle, Rey Mysterio, and Randy Orton would have been novel back then, it wasn't so novel in 2006 when such matches could be found on Monday nights on a regular basis. Hell, even the pay-per-view level showdown of Shawn Michaels taking on Shane McMahon in a street fight couldn't do enough to give off the impression that this show was anything of particular note. As you would expect then, ratings reflected this sentiment, as while the 3.1 Saturday Night's Main Event 32 received was decent for the time, it wasn't exactly blowaway in the same way that some episodes had been back in the 80s. And things would continue to fall in that respect as the Saturday Night's Main Event 33 came around a few months later and scored a 2.6. Really, this one could be considered an outright disappointment, as the card was actually a lot more stacked here, what with it featuring a main event of John Cena and Edge doing battle over the WWE title in a ladder match and all. And not just this, no, on top of the closer, there was the newly revived D-Generation X making short work of the Spirit Squad too, as well as WWE CW being present with a one-on-one bout between Sabu and Stevie Richards. Would things pick up again for subsequent episodes? No, unfortunately. Rather, Saturday Night's Main Event would continue to slip into irrelevance as it became generally accepted among fans that it was a distant third in terms of importance behind Raw and Smackdown. So much would this be the case, in fact, even WWE would begin to stop going as hard when it came to booking it, with the June 2nd, 2007 episode seeing such lowlights as John Cena vs. The Great Khali, Finlay and Hornswoggle teaming up to take on the Boogeyman and Little Boogeyman, and Kane, Doink, and Eugene main eventing against Kevin Thorne, Viscera, and Umaga. Sure, when it came time for the episode after that on August 18th, there would be some attempt to do something of note again, with the big selling point here being Evander Holyfield having a worked boxing match against Matt Hardy. But that was largely seen as a pretty weak publicity stunt, and so it didn't bring in a lot of viewers. So it should come as little surprise to learn then that by the time 2008 came around, NBC was once more getting cold feet about keeping Saturday Night's Main Event on a primetime slot on their network. And that led to the 36th episode of the show being make or break in many ways. Would it deliver? Well, no, would be the answer to that question, because while Edge main eventing against Jeff Hardy was something, other bouts like the Great Khali versus Jimmy Wang Yang left a lot to be desired, with all this leading to the show drawing a 1.4 rating. Yes, by now it was clear that the concept had run its course again, and once everyone accepted that, it would be a given that NBC was going to pull the plug, something they did after the show was over. So, like had happened all the way back in 1991, it felt like Saturday Night's Main Event was gone forever. But like with before, this would not prove to be the end. No, for a second time, the concept would get a revival in 2004. Why the comeback at this point? Well, that had everything to do with the fact that Smackdown, fresh off of leaving Fox, had moved back to the USA Network, with this once more putting it in the same family as NBC. So it was then that as WWE was undergoing its biggest wave of popularity in decades, Saturday Night's Main Event 37 would air on December 14th of that year. How would it do this time? Better. As while there was still the problem of the show no longer being as novel of a concept as it had been in the 80s, WWE were able to offset that somewhat by offering up a card that was less an episode of Raw and more a B-level pay-per-view. And we say that because it was here we'd get bouts like Liv Morgan defending her women's world title against Io Sky, Drew McIntyre and Sami Zayn having a grudge match, and Chelsea Green becoming the inaugural Women's United States Champion. Then, of course, there was the main event pitting Cody Rhodes and Kevin Owens against each other with the WWE title on the line. That and the reappearance of both Jesse Ventura on commentary and the original Obsession theme song. Basically, all of this is to say, what Triple H put out here was a much stronger effort than what Vince McMahon had done during the mid-2000s. Would this effort equal ratings, however? Yes and no, as it happened, because while these slightly under 2 million viewers they drew were decent for the time, they were about on par with the average episode of Raw, so nothing to write home about given the card that was on display here. That said, it was still seen as a win overall, enough to where NBC would be more than happy to continue on with more episodes as 2025 came around. And these would be big episodes for the most part, with the January 25th one seeing Gunther defend his World Heavyweight title against Jey Uso, All while elsewhere on the show, Braun Breaker was doing the same with his Intercontinental title while going one-on-one with Sheamus. Then of course there was the episode which followed that on May 24th. That one saw then World Heavyweight Champion Jey Uso put his gold on the line against Logan Paul. And if that wasn't enough to entice WWE fans to tune in, there was also John Cena and R-Truth going one-on-one, as well as Damian Priest beating Drew McIntyre inside a steel cage. As you would expect then, each of these shows did solid ratings for 2025. Sadly, however, this was where things would start to falter a little. Why was that? Well, because while it was billed as a huge event during the lead-up as a result of it featuring Bill Goldberg's in-ring retirement, Saturday night's main event would appear to fall below expectations, as Goldberg's retirement speech would be cut short while he was talking to the fans live. And it would also be around this time that the show would become a streaming exclusive on the Peacock app. That said, it would still be something valuable enough for WWE to keep putting out strong cards for. Hell, the November 1st edition would see 3 world title matches in Cody Rhodes vs. Drew McIntyre, Tiffany Stratton vs. Jade Cargill, and CM Punk vs. Jey Uso. And then of course there was Saturday night's main event 42, the show which came around on December 13th. That show would be completely unique as it featured the in-ring retirement of John Cena, WWE's biggest star since the Attitude Era. Obviously then, this was always going to be a big deal, and while the exact ratings are not known due to streaming services rarely releasing such data, based on the attendance of 19,000 alone, it's likely this show was a huge success. Hell, that's why it was such a smart move to use this one to highlight a lot of the up-and-coming stars in the undercard. We're talking about names like Javon Evans, Leon Slater, Obafemi, and Sol Ruca here. Of course, in the end though, the real draw was always going to be John Cena's last match against Gunther. And while the end of that bout might have been divisive to say the least, it left everyone with the sense that there was still juice left in the Saturday night's main event concept by the time it was all over. All that's left now then is to see where it will go in 2026 and beyond. As of the time of this video's recording, we already know the next episode will air on January 24th, and with it being held in Montreal, we'll likely see Sami Zayn play a big role. Aside from that though, it's largely guesswork as we all eagerly anticipate what's going to happen next. Will Saturday night's main event face the same fate it has twice before and eventually be pulled from the airways? Or will it continue to remain strong and go on for years to come? Possibly with more major moments happening on it as occurred during its original run in the 80s, or as has started to occur again in the latter half of 2025. That remains to be seen. One thing is for sure though, whatever the future holds for Saturday night's main event, its legacy is already secure as one of the most important shows in WWE's long history, as, were it not for it, we would have never gotten some of the more iconic moments in wrestling. And on top of that, who knows if we'd ever have gotten things like Raw and Smackdown, as in some ways they were only building on what was already created by Vince McMahon and Dick Ebersol back in the 80s. For a title to become an important part of one wrestling company's history is one thing, but for it to be an important part of 2 is almost unheard of. And for it to be a part of not just 3, but 4, well, that might only apply to one piece of gold out there, the gold we're going to be looking at today. So join us as we take a deep dive into the entire history of the United States title right now. The story begins on January 1st of 1975. That was the day a new belt was introduced to Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, the company which would later be renamed Jim Crockett Promotions. Why was a new belt being introduced here? Well, it was felt at the time that Mid-Atlantic needed something new which would boost fan interest, something which could be defended exclusively on their shows, but which retained the National Wrestling Alliance brand as a top-level prize. You see, back then there was only one sanctioned world champion in North America amongst territories which were part of the NWA, and this meant that for the vast majority of the time, each company had to deal with the fact that this world champion was not going to be a part of their show. No, unless the champ at any given time was a mainstay of your promotion, you could usually only count on them making it to your TV for a couple of weeks out of the year, with the rest of their time being spent traveling around the remainder of the country and defending against other performers in other states. So as a way to alleviate this, regional top titles were often used, with this being what gave us things like the NWA Tri-State North American Championship in Mid-South Wrestling and the NWA Pacific Northwest Heavyweight Championship in Portland. As for Mid-Atlantic, well, while originally the NWA Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Championship had filled this role, Come the mid-70s, it would quickly find its place being usurped by the NWA Mid-Atlantic United States Heavyweight title, the aforementioned new belt which was introduced here. Why was that? Well, part of the reason was because the standard of the early champs who had possession of this piece of gold were so high. Hell, that was evident with the very first man to call it his own, Harley Race, as by then, he was already a multiple-time NWA World's Champion. Yes, right away, it was made clear to fans that this was not going to be any old mid-card prize. Rather, it was going to be the top one contended for in Mid-Atlantic when the NWA World's Champion wasn't there, even a level above the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title. And as further proof of this, the rule was made early on that whoever held their US Heavyweight title whenever the top champ came into town would be considered the #1 contender to that belt. Obviously then, this was good news for Race, and it awarded him an opportunity or two to win the gold throughout the first half of 1975, right up until the point that he dropped it to Johnny Valentine on July 3rd of that year. How would Valentine's run on top fare in comparison to his precursor? Well, not quite as well, because while he would have a strong reign himself, Johnny would be forced to vacate the gold on October 4th, 1975, when a plane crash he was involved in left him so badly injured he'd have no choice but to retire from in-ring competition for good. Needless to say then, this was sad news for everyone who knew Johnny Valentine. But things had to carry on regardless, and so a tournament was held soon after this to crown a new champion, a tournament which was ultimately won by Terry Funk. Yes, the Funkster was now the champ. And over the course of what remained of 1975 and into 1976, he would be one of 3 people to hold the gold overall, as Blackjack Mulligan and Paul Jones would also get runs. That's right, while back at this point it wasn't uncommon for world champions to hold onto their belts for years at a time, when it came to top regional prizes, they changed hands a lot more frequently, with this continuing to be the case as 1977 and 1978 happened and Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Mr. Wrestling, and Bobo Brazil all got shots with the Mid-Atlantic US Heavyweight title. Of course, in Bobo's case, this win was particularly important though, as he became the first black man to hold the belt. That said, his run as Mid-Atlantic US champ would only last for 21 days before the gold ended up in the hands of Ric Flair once more. And the Nature Boy would still be in possession of it by the summer of 1979, at which point he was forced to vacate after winning the NWA World Tag Team titles and being deemed unable to carry out the duties of defending both prizes simultaneously. Who would be the next person to hold the gold following him then? Well, after defeating Ricky Steamboat in the finals of a tournament on September 1st, 1979, Jimmy Snuka would be crowned the new champion, and he'd go on to hold it for the next 232 days, all before it once again made its way into the hands of Slick Rick. That said, it wasn't like Rick would be the champ when the belt became undisputed. No, the man who had it then would be Roddy Piper, as not long after he bested Flair on January 27, 1981, the Mid-Atlantic version of the NWA United States Heavyweight title would become the only version of the NWA United States Heavyweight title, when NWA San Francisco, the last remaining territory to recognize such a prize, closed their doors for good. Yes, from this point onwards, there was only one US champion out there, and for the next 193 days, that champion would be Hot Rod. But even his reign would have to come to an end eventually, with this happening on August 8th of 1981 when, at a live event in Greensboro, North Carolina, Wahoo McDaniel got the better of the kayfabe Scotsman. So it was then that around this point, what many consider to be the start of the golden age for the United States title began, as between then and the spring of 1985, the belt would be passed around between McDaniel, Piper, Ricky Steamboat, Greg Valentine, Sergeant Slaughter, and Dick Slater. Needless to say then, the US strap really felt like a top prize here, one which was worthy of being put in the same echelon as the NWA World's title at points. Basically, it was on the level of what the World Heavyweight Championship is at in WWE today when compared to the WWE title, or where the television title was in ECW during Rob Van Dam's legendary reign in the late 90s. But even this wouldn't be the apex of the prize. No, its apex arguably came in November of 1985, as that was when, after Tully Blanchard had won it 8 months prior, he'd put it up for grabs during a now iconic I Quit Steel Cage match against Magnum TA at the 3rd annual Starrcade show. What made this moment so special? Well, to this day, it's the match which many consider to be the greatest cage bout of all time. And like any good blow-off to a feud, it all ended with the babyface winning. As from there, Magnum TA would spend the next 153 days as champion. Really, this was supposed to be the moment that Magnum fully arrived as the heir apparent to what had by now long since transformed from Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling into Jim Crockett Promotions. And had the Chesapeake native not gotten badly injured during a car crash a mere 1 year later, forcing him into early retirement, he likely would have taken up this role. Yes, it's one of the greatest what-ifs in wrestling history, as there's a parallel timeline where, after first establishing himself with the United States heavyweight title, Magnum TA goes on to become the new face of the National Wrestling Alliance and the grittier, more adult-friendly alternative to what Hulk Hogan was doing over in the WWF. But that's not what happened. No, instead, the era of the man who would be king would be over, and it wouldn't be until decades later that an eerily similar rise played out with another cowboy Virginian who was very popular with the ladies and who served as the main character babyface of WWE's top competitor. But for as much as it might have been for Magnum to see history repeat itself under better terms, it must still hurt to know that he never got to reach such heights himself. No, he'd be out from here on in, and in his place, the mantle of US heavyweight champion over the next couple of years would instead pass on to the likes of Nikita Koloff, Lex Luger, Dusty Rhodes, and Barry Windham. In fact, it would be Barry Windham who'd be the man holding the title when, in early 1989, Jim Crockett Promotions was bought out by billionaire media mogul Ted Turner and was from there reborn as World Championship Wrestling. Sure, the title would still hold the NWA branding for the time being, but it was clear that it was now entering a whole new era of existence as a transitional period began. A period which saw it spend both 1989 and 1990 being bounced around between Lex Luger, Michael Hayes, and Stan Hansen, with the total package at one point holding it for a record 523 days. How would this transitional era end? Well, in early 1991, after WCW formally seceded from the National Wrestling Alliance, the United States heavyweight title would drop any reference to being sanctioned by the NWA and would instead become known as the WCW United States Heavyweight Championship. Who were some of the first holders of this version of the belt? Well, after Lex Luger had to vacate it after he won the WCW World Heavyweight title, a then still young up-and-comer named Sting would reign victorious during a tournament to crown a new champ on August 25th of that year. And so, like that, the 90s would get off to a strong start in terms of the prize which had first been held by Harley Race all those years earlier. And things would only get better as the decade progressed because by the time 1994 was over, present and future legends like Rick Rude, Jim Duggan, Vader, Dustin Rhodes, and Steve Austin would also have added their names to the ranks of those who had held the title in their hands and called it their own. Hell, it was his run as United States champion which really first put the future Stone Cold on the map back then when he was still a relative rookie in 1993. So while it was no longer a belt being positioned on the same level as the world title, it was still serving an important role in elevating that next generation of stars further up the card, just as the Intercontinental title was doing over in WWF. Why had it become a mid-card belt here rather than the top prize for a territory as it had been before? Well, once WCW left the NWA, there was no more NWA World's title being defended on their shows. No, now they had their own world title, one which was exclusive to them and which wouldn't spend the majority of any given year traveling around the country being defended at other states. Of course, while this might have been sad for some to see, it was an inevitable shift which simply couldn't be avoided after a while, and it opened the door to a whole new tier of performers having a real chance at winning the prize. So it was then that over the next couple of years, Kensuke Sasaki, One Man Gang, and Conan would all get their own runs with it. But once Conan lost the gold, everything changed, as this was the point the New World Order took over WCW, and in the process of doing so, rocketed the company to previously unseen heights. That's right, in the summer of 1996 and throughout 1997, World Championship Wrestling was the undisputed #1 wrestling promotion on the planet. So because of this, the United States title suddenly got exposed to a whole new audience who hadn't grown up watching Jim Crockett Promotions. And that worked out great for new first-time champions who would hold it here. We're talking about people like Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Jeff Jarrett, Kurt Hennig, Diamond Dallas Page, and Raven. Sure, Steve McMichael wouldn't exactly be the most beloved champ ever, but even he was a former member of the Four Horsemen, so the prestige of the gold remained regardless. And that prestige would be even more evident during another run which served as a contender for the highest watermark the US title ever reached, the reign of Bill Goldberg. You see, back in 1998, Bill Goldberg was absolutely a phenomenon approaching the level of what Stone Cold Steve Austin was doing over on the other channel. And the way he'd been able to get to this point was by spending his first year and a half in WCW mowing through absolutely everyone who was put up against him in short order. So when he finally got a shot at the secondary prize on April 20th, 1998 then, it felt like a given he'd be taking it home once the evening was over. And take it home he would. With this meaning that when he beat Hollywood Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight title a couple of months later in front of 41,000 rabid fans at the Georgia Dome, he'd still be in possession of it and would be an official double champion. Sadly though, this night would also mark the end of Goldberg's run as US champion because, as per the rules of World Championship Wrestling at the time, 2 singles belts could not be defended simultaneously. So as a result of this, the Tulsa native would be forced to vacate the mid-card prize with immediate effect. What happened to it after that? Well, over the remainder of 1998 and into 1999, things would get pretty erratic as the US title went from Bret Hart to Lex Luger to Diamond Dallas Page to Rowdy Roddy Piper to Scott Hall to Scott Steiner to David Flair to Chris Benoit to Sid Vicious, and then all the way back to Bill Goldberg again. Needless to say then, its value was dropping fast here, and that value would only lessen as the infamous WCW 2000 came around and it was won by Hugh Morris, Shane Douglas, Rick Steiner, and Lance Storm. Sure, Lance did try to do something interesting with it when he renamed it the Canadian Heavyweight Championship on account of him being from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, but that was only a short-lived run, and for as fun as it wasn't able to overcome the disaster that was World Championship Wrestling during its last full year in business. No, by this point, the die had been cast on WCW, and that would all lead to March of 2001, the point the once mighty promotion finally went out of business. Who would be the champ during that last episode of Nitro? Well, it would be Booker T, someone who, as a result of him beating Scott Steiner the same evening, would also close the doors on the company as its final world champion too. Did that mean the United States title? The title once so proudly worn by legends like Ric Flair, Sting, Dusty Rhodes, and Magnum TA would never be seen again after this? Well, not quite. And the reason for that is because once WCW went out of business, Vince McMahon would buy them up for pennies on the dollar, meaning he now owned his competition and all of their intellectual property. So as you would expect, with the invasion angle taking hold in the summer of 2001, not only the United States title, but all other noteworthy World Championship Wrestling titles would make their way over to WWF TV. Not that Booker T, the final champ, would be the man carrying the US strap into this new battle for his company. No, as he was also the world champion and felt that defending this was responsibility enough, on the July 24th episode of Smackdown that year, he'd gift the secondary prize to Chris Kanyon. What happened from there? Well, from there, the next couple of months would see the belt jump around between WWF guys and Alliance guys, with it at various points coming into the possession of Tajiri, Rhino, Kurt Angle, and Edge. And that would lead us into Survivor Series in November of 2001, the night that the invasion angle came to an end when all the mid-card belts were unified and one promotion was put under once and for all. As to who the last US champion was at that show, well, this would be Edge, someone who'd beaten then Intercontinental champion Test that night in Greensboro to unify both belts and formally retire one of the National Wrestling Alliance's most prized pieces of hardware. That said, even this wouldn't be the end of the United States title forever. No, in July of 2003, it would make a surprise reappearance. And the reason this happened was because, with the brand split having now been instituted and both Raw and SmackDown having been divided into 2 separate rosters, it was felt that a strong mid-card title was going to be needed for each show. So with Monday nights having the Intercontinental title then, it would be announced that the US strap would be getting reactivated and would be exclusive to the Blue brand going forward, with it now officially going by the name of the WWE United States Championship. Yes, for the 3rd time in its history, the US title would be transferred over to an all-new company, just as it had done years prior when Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling became Jim Crockett Promotions, and again when JCP morphed into WCW. The only difference this time was that, for as big as World Championship Wrestling had been in the mid-90s, being a part of the WWE machine going forward marked probably its highest watermark in terms of worldwide visibility. Who would be the first person to hold it during this incarnation? Well, that would be someone who'd actually already held it back in WCW, Eddie Guerrero. Obviously then, the logic here was to try and make that transfer in lineage as smooth as possible, all while continuing the tradition of having the US strap be held by performers who could easily be in the main event of a show. And that would continue with the next couple of champs too, as they would be The Big Show and a then young up-and-coming rookie by the name of John Cena. That's right, before he was Mr. Hustle, Loyalty, and Respect, Big Match John was rising up the card in his Doctor of Thugonomics guise. And it was in this guise that he held the United States title 3 times between March of 2004 and March of 2005. Hell, he probably would have held it even more times here had he not ascended to the level of world champion in 2005. Again, keeping up a prior tradition of the US belt elevating younger talent. Who Who would pick up the mantle of this prize once Cena left it behind? Well, that would be names like Carlito, Orlando Jordan, Chris Benoit, and Booker T. And the feud the latter two men had over the gold was particularly interesting, as it saw them redo their classic Best of 7 series from WCW, the one in which they had originally fought over the very same piece of hardware. That said, for as good as things were going, there was a downturn waiting just around the corner. After all, given that the Intercontinental title was starting to lose some of its prestige over on Raw as the 2000s reached their midpoint, the same fate would inevitably befall the US title too. Yes, there were some less successful runs as the second half of the decade got going, runs from performers such as Fit Finlay and Mr. Kennedy. But then to be fair, there would also be pretty good ones from up-and-comers like Bobby Lashley and MVP, as well as solid reigns from more established acts like JBL and Matt Hardy. In fact, the Matt Hardy MVP feud over the belt is another one which remains fondly remembered to this day. Unfortunately though, it would also mark the point that the US strap stopped being Smackdown exclusive. Why was that? Well, because while Hardy was in possession of it in 2008, he'd be drafted over to the WWE CW brand, with this making the belt exclusive to the C Show for a brief period. Sure, that would change once Shelton Benjamin won it a few weeks later and took it back home to the Blue brand, but even this wouldn't be permanent, as after the Standard of Excellence dropped it to his future Hurt Syndicate stablemate MVP, and MVP was drafted over to Raw in 2009, the United States title would become a red brand-only piece of gold. How would the belt do over on Raw? Well, in truth, this was where it really started to lose its prestige, as while there were some very talented performers who held it during the early years of the 2010s, the booking often left a lot to be desired, as the once mighty prize never felt more like a nothing prop for the mid-card. Hell, even runs from people like Daniel Bryan, Kofi Kingston, Dolph Ziggler, and Sheamus couldn't help to turn its fortunes around here. And as for The Miz and R-Truth, well, they had even less success in doing so. That said, there would be one bright spot here, as it would be in May of 2010 that Bret Hart got another token run with it when he tapped Mike Mizanin out on an episode of Raw. Still though, while this was nice in the moment, in the long run all it did was further help to devalue the belt, as if a retired wrestler who wasn't even cleared to perform could win it, then how important could it be? And that downward trajectory would only continue as the 2010s got into full swing, and with the brand extension now over, the title was defended on both shows, in the process being passed around by lower card acts such as Zack Ryder, Jack Swagger, Santino Marella, and Kalisto. Sure, there would be an occasional bright spark to be found, like when Cesaro, Rusev, or Dean Ambrose held the gold, but overall it was clear the once mighty prize's best days were behind it. That was until they weren't, because against all odds, in 2015 the US strap would get a complete revival when John Cena won it at WrestleMania 31. Yes, this was the period where Big Match John went on his now legendary US title weekly open challenge run, something which, for the first time in WWE, raised the status of the mid-card gold to something approaching the level of a world title. Hell, at SummerSlam that same year, it would be in the main event, as John Cena defended it against then WWE champion Seth Rollins in a winner-takes-all match, a match which was ultimately won by the Architect. Where would it go now that Rollins had it? Well, from here it would bounce back to Cena for a while, all before moving on to other big names like Alberto Del Rio, Roman Reigns, Chris Jericho, and Kevin Owens. That's right, probably the best storyline WWE had during 2016 and 2017, the bromance between Y2J and KO, ultimately centered around them doing battle over the United States title at WrestleMania 33. And once that feud was over, the secondary prize would continue its second wind, as with the brand extension now a thing once more, it would spend some time over on Smackdown again, there being held by the likes of AJ Styles and Randy Orton. Sadly though, some of the other champions here would be performers such as Baron Corbin, Bobby Roode, and Jinder Mahal, with this meaning that, yes, despite getting that boost in the immediate wake of John Cena's open challenge run, the US belt was now beginning to fall in prominence again. And that would only be more apparent as the 2010s came to an end, because while Jeff Hardy, Shinsuke Nakamura, Rey Mysterio, Samoa Joe, Ricochet, and Andrade were all great champions on paper, with each being an excellent wrestler in their own right, their booking while in the possession of the gold left a lot to be desired and made it next to impossible to get invested in any storylines they were involved in. Would this continue to be the case as the 2020s got going? Yeah, unfortunately, as here, while the world was going into lockdown, new first-time champs like Apollo Crews, Matt Riddle, Finn Balor, and Damian Priest wouldn't even be able to get out of the starting blocks. But things would finally start to turn around again in mid-2022, as that was when, with Vince McMahon being ousted from his own company for the first time amidst a sea of scandal and lawsuits, Triple H would take over the book and would immediately begin the process of trying to repair the prestige of the mid-card straps. Sure, you could argue the US title didn't fare as well as the Intercontinental title did here because, while Gunther's 666-day run with the latter belt saw it be completely reborn again, the former WCW prize would only partially be revived. Yes, it did get more focus placed upon it under the game, and would be treated like a serious thing to go after again to some degree, but champs like Austin Theory just never got over enough to justify being in possession of it, and first-time holders like Logan Paul weren't exactly in the spirit of early winners like Harley Race and Terry Funk. That said, even if there were some stumbles, overall the United States title has fared a lot better under Triple H than it did under Vince McMahon. And this has continued to be the case during the last year or two, as it was in 2024 that LA Knight, one of WWE's biggest cult sensations in recent times, got his own go-around with the mid-card gold, and he wouldn't be the only performer looking to break out to that next level who'd hold it around this point either. No, Solo Sikoa and Jacob Fatu would also do the same. And of course, when they didn't have the belt around their waists, the tradition of already top-level acts winning it would be kept up by Sami Zayn during his reign between August and October of 2025. And with him now dropping it to Ilya Dragunov as of the October 17th episode of Smackdown, it looks like he's done his job in getting another young star over. Where will the belt go from here now that the Mad Russian has it around his waist? We guess we'll just have to wait and see. But one thing is for sure, after a few bumpy years there, it looked like the United States title has once again settled into a groove which will see it retain a level of importance within the WWE for the foreseeable future. Yes, all the United States belt needs to do going forward is keep doing what it's doing, what it's always done when it's been at its best, and that's both help elevate younger talent, all while giving more established main eventers a prize they can fight over when they're not chasing the world title. After all, nothing will make a strap feel more important than having top guys want to have it in their possession, and hungry young up-and-comers want it even more. For most of WWE's history, there was one world champion, but there have been points where this has not been the case. 2 points, in fact. And it's the second belt which was introduced during these periods which we're going to be looking at right now in the history of the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. It started in 2002. Prior to that, WWE had one world title on their books, or at least one world title for the men. That had been the case ever since the WWF title was first won by Buddy Rogers back in 1963, and it had remained the case throughout the eras of subsequent stars like Bruno Sammartino, Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and The Rock. As the new millennium got into full swing, however, there would be change in the air which necessitated something radically different be done. What was this change? Well, it was the brand extension. Yes, after acquiring both WCW and ECW in 2001, and with this, a large chunk of each promotion's roster, Vince McMahon had initially tried to run his former top competitor as its own separate brand with its own separate titles. But when that failed to get off the ground, he was instead forced to go with the infamous Invasion angle, one which was so poorly executed, it was done by the time the winter had arrived. But while the Invasion was now over, the bloated roster remained. And so this was why the boss came upon the idea of creating his own competition going forward by dividing his talent pool into two groups, one which would be exclusive to Raw and another which would be exclusive to Smackdown. And this was exactly what happened on March 25th, 2002, as that was the night the first draft took place, a draft which saw names like The Undertaker and Kane become Monday Night Only acts, all while others such as The Rock, Kurt Angle, and Hulk Hogan were moving over to Thursdays full-time. What did this mean for the world title? Well, at first it was business as usual, as after the Invasion came to a full end at Vengeance the prior year when Chris Jericho unified both the WWF and WCW world belts, he'd become the first ever undisputed champion. And while he was no longer in possession of that when the brand split happened, the person who was, Triple H, would have a passport to go between both shows for as long as he held it. Yes, the idea here was that, like with the NWA World's title during the Territory days, the undisputed champion would go between Raw and SmackDown and take on all challengers who were put up against him. But while this was a good idea in theory, pretty quickly Vince McMahon decided it wasn't something which was working for him in practice, as after a few months of the likes of The Game, Hulk Hogan, The Undertaker, and The Rock being traveling champs, the booking issues began to show themselves, with the main issue being that if the undisputed champion was over on Raw working a program for a month, then it left SmackDown with a lot less to do in terms of their own main event scene. Could this situation have been alleviated by raising the likes of the Intercontinental title and the United States title to the level of regional top prizes? Maybe, but that's not what the boss went with in the end. No, instead Vince had both Raw and SmackDown general managers Eric Bischoff and Stephanie McMahon each court Brock Lesnar after he won the undisputed title from The Rock at SummerSlam that August and try to get him to sign full-time to their show. And when Stephanie and the Smackdown brand came out the winner in this bidding war, the door was suddenly open for a new top prize to be announced. What would this new top prize be? Well, that would become evident on the September 2nd, 2002 edition of Raw, as that was the night Eric Bischoff came out to present Triple H with a very special gift. That's right, it was here that Eazy-E officially crowned the game as the inaugural World Heavyweight Champion, with the belt being used for this being the old big gold belt first made famous by Ric Flair back in his WCW days. Obviously then, the symbolism was clear here, and that symbolism was that, while this wasn't the WCW World Heavyweight title, it was a spiritual successor to it in many ways. But why had Triple H simply been awarded it without having to fight anyone for it? Well, in kayfabe, the reason was that Bischoff saw him as being the clear #1 guy on the brand, way above any of the babyfaces. Whatever the truth was, however, it didn't really matter. No, all that mattered was now, for the first time in WWE's history, there were two recognized world champions, one for each brand. And while the WWE title was seen by many, if not most, as the real top prize given the lineage it had, which went all the way back to George Hackenschmidt, it wouldn't take long for the new prize to gain credibility in its own right. How did it do this? Well, a large part of the reason was because it was held by Triple H for so long here. Yes, with the game arguably being the most recognizable mainstream act the company had on a full-time basis back then due to both his success in the Attitude Era and the fact that Steve Austin and The Rock each had one foot out the door, it meant he was able to add a sense of gravitas to the new gold. That said, he wouldn't be the only person who'd hold it here. No, aside from him, there would also be short reigns from the likes of Shawn Michaels, Goldberg, and Randy Orton. Hell, Randy Orton's win at SummerSlam 2004 would actually make him the youngest world champion in WWE history, a record which still stands to this day. And as for HBK's big victory, well, that would mark his last run as a world champion during his in-ring career. That said, for as notable as these victories were, the reality remained that between the autumn of 2002 and the spring of 2005, this was Triple H's belt. So much so that he was never not in possession of it for longer than a few months. Hell, there's a reason this period is known as the Reign of Terror, and that's because the future head booker held such a stranglehold over the gold here, the show became incredibly frustrating to watch at times for many fans, and managed to turn more than a few people off entirely, as so many promising potential champions like Rob Van Dam, and perhaps most infamously Booker T, were buried by the game. Thankfully though, this reign of terror wouldn't last forever, and when it did end, it ended in a major feel-good way, which made it feel worthwhile. What was the climax to this story in 2005? Well, after the game had formed Evolution a couple of years prior, and had started building up a then young upstart by the name of Dave Bautista to serve as his protege, the Animal eventually tired of his boss's bullying ways, and after winning the 2005 Royal Rumble, challenged him and beat him in the main event of WrestleMania 21 to take home the gold for himself. That's right, going forward, Batista was now the new World Heavyweight Champion, something he solidified by beating Triple H clean twice more on pay-per-view in the months following. But he wouldn't be a Raw exclusive for much longer because during the 2005 draft, a major spanner was thrown into the works of WWE's main event scene. What was that spanner? Well, it involved Big Dave and then WWE champion John Cena switching brands, with that meaning the Animal and, as a consequence, the World Heavyweight title would now become exclusive property of SmackDown. Why had this been done? Well, back then, Raw was still very much seen as being the A show, and so because of that, it was felt it needed both the new top star of the company in John Cena and the real top prize in the WWE title on its TV every week. That's right, after fighting the perception that it was secondary to the real world title for years prior to this, the move over to the Thursday nights only seemed to solidify the fact that the World Heavyweight Championship would never be the #1 piece of hardware in WWE. No, at best, it could only be a 1A. but that still made it a very valuable prize, valuable enough that if you were a men's wrestler on Smackdown, this represented the highest peak you could achieve. And that was why everyone on that brand wanted a piece of it over the months which followed. That said, in the end, no one person would be able to take it away from Batista. Rather, he'd be ultimately forced to vacate it in January of 2006 when a tricep tear put him on the injury shelf. So what happened next then? Well, a tournament would be held to crown a new champion, a tournament eventually won by Kurt Angle. And this set up a situation where, at WrestleMania 22, the Olympic hero would defend against both Randy Orton and Rey Mysterio. Needless to say that if you were watching at the time, you no doubt remember that as the show where Ray won the big one in honor of Eddie Guerrero, someone who had passed away only a few months prior as a result of a heart attack at just 38 years old. Yes, it was another true feel-good moment, but not one which would last because, as the months progressed and Mysterio's title run got going, it became apparent that Vince McMahon didn't see much in him as a tippy-top guy, primarily because he was under 6 feet in height. So because of that, Ray's reign would be mostly characterized by him losing frequently in non-title matches, barely eking out wins when the belt was on the line, and then eventually dropping the gold to King Booker at the Great American Bash in July of that year. Still though, even if Ray's run was massively botched, King Booker's subsequent go-around on top went a lot better. In fact, this was the point that Booker T first truly felt like a top guy in WWE, and that, in turn, helped to raise the value of the big gold belt up again after it had been damaged during the move over from Raw to SmackDown. Would this momentum be able to continue for the World Heavyweight title as the decade progressed? Yes. And we say that because it would be held by a number of additional main eventers over the next few years. We're talking about names like The Undertaker and Edge here. Hell, so strong would these two men's runs be, they'd even main event WrestleMania 24 together with the World Heavyweight title on the line, with that being the first time such a thing had happened since Dave Batista's big win 3 years prior. Honestly, if you were to pick one person who became most synonymous with the big gold belt during the mid to late 2000s, then it would probably be the rated R superstar. That said, for as strong as his run was, there were some stinkers in there too, the most notable of which was probably the Great Khali's run in the summer of 2007, a contender for worst world title run of all time if there ever was one. But again, change was about to come, and soon this SmackDown brand would no longer be the home of the World Heavyweight title. No, it was time for it to switch around once more, something which was done in order to freshen up WWE's main event scene. How would the shift happen this time? Well, rather than it happen as a result of the champ getting drafted, it would instead be a Money in the Bank cash-in which did it, as it was on June 30th of 2008 that CM Punk used his guaranteed world title shot on Edge to take home the gold for himself. And because Punk was a Raw wrestler here, that meant the big gold belt would once more be a part of Monday nights, for a little while at least. That's right, while Raw would now be the home of the World Heavyweight title, this new arrangement only lasted for a year. But during that year, there were a lot of noteworthy moments created, two of the biggest of which were probably Chris Jericho winning it and using it as a prize for the grand finale of his excellent feud with Shawn Michaels, and John Cena claiming it as his own for the first time in his career. Come the summer of 2009, however, it would be back on Thursday nights, as that was when Jeff Hardy won it and then proceeded to bounce it between himself and the Second City Saint for the next couple of months as SmackDown audiences got reacclimatized to having this particular piece of hardware back on the show again. How would things fare for the belt from here as the 2000s ended and the 2010s dawned? Well, there would be ups and downs, as while the runs of people like Christian were pretty good, there were also some major low points, as can be seen in the period where Jack Swagger and a now much older Kane were in possession of the gold. And it also hurt that the man most commonly associated with the World Heavyweight title in many ways, Edge, would be forced to vacate it before he could drop it on account of a neck injury so bad no doctor would clear him to return to action for the next 9 years. But perhaps worst of all was the fact that with the belt being a SmackDown exclusive again here, its perception amongst fans was seriously damaged, as this was the point that the Blue brand effectively became a recap show for Raw for a couple of years. That's right, by now the brand extension really only existed in theory, as SmackDown wrestlers were regularly appearing on Raw. And whenever the World Heavyweight title was brought over to Monday nights, it was very clearly being positioned as inferior to the WWE title. Really, come the early 2010s, the gold had ceased to be a true world title in many fans' eyes and was more in line with what the Intercontinental strap had been back during the 80s and 90s, something which still had value, but which was going to be fought over primarily by the mid-card. And that could be seen in some of the champions we got as the decade fully got going. We're talking about names like Mark Henry and The Big Show here. Yes, Alberto Del Rio and Sheamus, two guys who were still in the higher end of the WWE pecking order, would get their runs too, but this seemed more like a demotion of them at the time rather than an elevation of the title. And then there was Daniel Bryan's run, a run which was never supposed to happen in the first place and which only came about after Mark Henry got injured and the American Dragon just so happened to be in town that night so he could cash in his Money in the Bank contract. Sure, Bryan may have been the best wrestler in the world in 2011, but the fact that the belt was given to him so haphazardly here said it all about how Vince McMahon saw not only him, but the World Heavyweight title in general. Basically, what we're saying here is that during the early 2010s, the prize, which had initially been introduced as being something on the same level as the WWE title, was in dire straits, and was fast losing whatever relevance it was still able to cling on to. That said, even with the depths it was falling to, there was one last hurrah it would get, a final moment of greatness, if you will, and that moment would come on the April 8th, 2013 episode of Raw. What happened here? Well, this was the night that Dolph Ziggler cashed in his own Money in the Bank contract to win the gold from Alberto Del Rio. That's right, arguably the greatest cash-in of all time occurred here, one which got a monstrous pop from the crowd in attendance once they realized what was happening, as finally, it looked like the show-off was about to ascend to that next level. Sadly though, Ziggler would not end up rising up the card permanently, and before long, the World Heavyweight title was back to being a glorified mid-card belt. So much so that once the brand split officially ended soon thereafter, it became clear it had no reason to exist anymore. And so that was why in the winter of 2013, the man then in possession of it, John Cena, laid out a challenge to then WWE Champion Randy Orton that the two have a ladder match where both pieces of gold would be on the line, and the winner would unify them into one single WWE World Heavyweight title. Yes, for the first time in over a decade, there was going to be one undisputed champion in WWE again. And with this new belt carrying on the lineage of the more important WWE title, it meant the World Heavyweight title's time would come to an end here. Well, kind of. Because after the Viper beat Big Match John to unify both prizes at December 15th's TLC, Tables, Ladders, and Chairs pay-per-view, the belt would continue to appear on TV for a few months, as the new title was represented by both of the former Raw and SmackDown pieces of hardware. So because of that, when Daniel Bryan came out victorious in the main event of WrestleMania 30, one of the two belts he'd hold over his head would be the big gold belt. And when he was forced to vacate a few months later, and John Cena won it at Money in the Bank, the same situation would play out with him too. Really, it wasn't until the night after SummerSlam in August of 2014 that the title, which once represented WCW, would officially be retired, as by that point, a new single title would be introduced to serve as the WWE World Heavyweight Championship going forward. Did that mean we would never see the big gold belt on WWE TV again? Sadly, yes. But it wouldn't be the last time a second world title was introduced in WWE, as once the brand extension was reinstituted in 2016, the WWE World Heavyweight title became a Smackdown exclusive, with this leading to the Universal title being created for Raw. Again though, like had happened before, those two belts would end up being unified when, at WrestleMania 38 in April of 2022, Roman Reigns pinned Brock Lesnar to continue his reign of dominance over the company as its tribal chief by becoming the undisputed WWE Universal Champion. Given he was a blue brand wrestler then, what did this mean for Raw? Well, at least initially it meant that, similar to what had happened with the Undisputed title back in 2002, Roman would be able to go from show to show as a traveling champion. Hell, this actually made all the sense in the world, as at that point he was still carrying around both belts, signifying that they could technically be separated again. But while this was a good idea initially, after a while it became clear it wasn't going to work because, with Reigns by this point being a part-timer, it felt like he was only showing up to TV a handful of times a year. And given the fact that most of those dates were taking place on SmackDown, Monday nights was really going to need a top prize of their own again. So it was that in the spring of 2023, Triple H would come out to the ring on an episode of Raw to announce the creation of a new world title, the World Heavyweight title. Needless to say then, this felt instantly familiar to fans of the 2000s and early 2010s, especially as the design of the belt paid some serious homage to the big gold belt Ric Flair had made his own back in the day. But technically, this one would not carry on the same lineage as the previous World Heavyweight title. No, it would start an all-new lineage, one which would immediately make it difficult for this piece of gold to be thought of on the same level as the one Roman Reigns had. So that meant whoever was going to hold it first would have a tall task ahead of them when it came to establishing it as something which could stand as the most sought-after prize on the red brand. Luckily then, the first person to hold it would be more than up to this task, as that man would be none other than Seth Rollins, one of WWE's top in-ring performers for as long as he's worked for the company. That's right, after he became the inaugural champ upon beating the Phenomenal One at Night of Champions on May 27th that year, he defended with much more frequency than his former Shield brother was doing with his world title over on Smackdown. What effect did this have? Well, the main effect was that it positioned the World Heavyweight title as the workhorse belt, the one the real wrestlers wanted to go after, similar to the reputation the Intercontinental title had when it was at its peak during the 80s and 90s, all while making the undisputed WWE Universal title feel like the Hollywood prize, the one people like Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar were after. Yes, like that, this new belt had an identity of its own, separate from the other men's world title in the company. And with Seth almost always delivering a show-stealing performance each time he defended it, fans quickly came to embrace it, even those who weren't too excited about it being reintroduced in the first place. Hell, so successful would Rollins be in his role as ace of the Raw brand throughout 2023, he'd still be holding the gold well into 2024, all the way up until WrestleMania in April, in fact. That said, for as great of a run as Seth had here, it was always going to have to come to an end eventually, and this would occur at WrestleMania itself when the champ was bested by Drew McIntyre. Obviously then, given how great his 2023 had been, fans expected this to be the start of a long run on top for the Scotsman, but that was not to be because after CM Punk helped to lay Drew out once the belt was over, Damian Priest would run down to the ring to successfully cash in his Money in the Bank contract. How would Priest's run go from here? Pretty well as it happened, especially considering this was his first run as any kind of world champion at all. And there lay the value of the World Heavyweight Champion during the 2020s, as if the WWE title was going to be the domain of performers such as Roman Reigns, Cody Rhodes, and John Cena, the tippy top names in the company, then the top prize on Raw allowed for people who were bubbling under the main event level to elevate themselves to the next rung on the ladder. Just look at the man who eventually beat the Archer of Infamy for the gold, the mighty Gunther. Yes, after his record-breaking 666-day run as Intercontinental Champion, he'd be able to fully establish himself as a main event player by winning the World Heavyweight title in August of 2024. And he wasn't the only person who was going from the upper mid-card to the main event with a well-placed world title win over on Raw around this time, as at WrestleMania 41 in April of 2025, Jey Uso would get his own go-around with the gold, something which capped off a meteoric rise he'd had in WWE during the years prior. Of course, as things stand today though, neither Gunther nor Jey Uso are the champ. No, after the latter lost the belt back to the former, and then the former very briefly lost it to CM Punk, a move which made the Second City Saint the only man to hold both versions of the title, it would move back on to the inaugural champion Seth Rollins again. And once Seth had it back, it seemed like he was going to go on another lengthy run on top, as with the Vision by his side, he was fully the ace of Monday nights once more. Unfortunately though, one thing you can't prepare for in wrestling is injuries. And it would be an injury that the Architect picked up in October of 2025, which forced him to vacate the gold he'd just won 2 months prior. So for that reason then, the belt was vacated, to be awarded to the victor of a match between #1 contender CM Punk and winner of a battle royal to determine his opponent, main event Jey Uso, at Saturday night's main event on November 1st, which was ultimately won by the Second City Saint. Really though, the long play doesn't seem to be Punk calling himself the champ, rather it seems to be Braun Breaker who's being set up to eventually win it. That's right, the man who's already being positioned to one day take over Roman Reigns' role as King of WWE will likely first hold a top prize when he inevitably wins the World Heavyweight title, possibly as soon as WrestleMania 42. What will this mean for the overall legacy of the belt which, a break in lineage aside, goes all the way back to Triple H in 2002? Well, it can only add to its prestige. Of course, this is probably something it deserves, as while it might not have been around for as long, either in its first iteration or the second, the people who have held it make up a who's who of some of the biggest stars of their era. Come on now, when a prize has been around the waist of legends like Triple H, Batista, John Cena, Randy Orton, Chris Jericho, and more, how can it ever truly be considered anything less than top tier? So expect its status to only grow even more as the years go on, and additional stars of the past, present, and future add their names to its list of holders. Back at the turn of the millennium, wrestling was on fire to such a level that the top two promotions couldn't just have one weekly TV show each. No, they had to have two. And for the WWE side of the equation, this second show would end up being one which was called Smackdown. How would Smackdown fare initially, and where has it gone since those early days? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now in the entire history of Smackdown. Back in the late 90s, wrestling reached mainstream levels of success it had never achieved before, not even during the 80s when Hulk Hogan was at his peak. And with there being two powerhouses during this period in WWF and WCW, it was inevitable that both were going to start expanding to even greater degrees before long. Who would do this first? Well, it would be World Championship Wrestling, who first introduced their secondary show, Thunder, in January of 1998, a show which met with much success for the company during those early days at least. So, not wanting to waste any more time encountering, Vince McMahon would work with the UPN network to bring his own B show to life in April of 1999 when they introduced the world to their newest creation, Smackdown. Of course, during that initial episode, it wasn't a guarantee that Smackdown was going to become a weekly show. No, this was very much considered a pilot, with there being a possibility of more if it happened to be a success. Luckily then, the show was a success, with the big takeaway storyline-wise from that debut being the formation of the corporate ministry, the most unholy corporate merger of all time. That said, it wasn't just the antics of The Undertaker, Shane McMahon, and other heels which made this one worth watching. No, the real star of the show on that night was the man SmackDown had been named after. That's right, so white hot was The Rock come the spring of 1999, one of his catchphrases would be used as the name for this event. It would be like if WWE introduced a new show today and called it Ula Fala. And when SmackDown was commissioned as a full-time weekly series soon thereafter and began airing as such a few months later in August, this would be the name which would remain associated with it. Obviously then, Dwayne Johnson would be all over those early shows, but he wasn't all there was, as looking to establish this as more than just a B show, WWF would throw all their stars on those initial episodes of the Blue brand. We're talking about people like Mick Foley, Triple H, Chris Jericho, and of course Stone Cold Steve Austin here. And that was a smart move as it happened because during those initial years, SmackDown had a big advantage over Raw in the fact that it was on network TV, meaning it was available to watch to a much wider audience than Raw was on cable. Yes, UPN and USA had a big difference in reach. So this meant, in theory, more people would be watching the Blue brand every week than they would the Red one. As you would imagine then, there were a lot of things which happened on Thursday nights at this point, things such as Vince McMahon infamously winning the WWF title from Triple H that September, or perhaps the only buried alive match ever given away on weekly TV. Really, it was more of an extension of what was happening on Monday nights rather than a separate show, and that helped to make it just as much see as Raw. That said, it wasn't like SmackDown didn't have some struggles during those early days. After all, mere months after it debuted and was still trying to establish itself, the top star in the company, Steve Austin, would have to take a year out of the ring to go get neck surgery. Thankfully though, while this could have been a complete disaster, the roster was so strong back then that his absence was barely felt. And that was still true as 2000 rolled around and the work rate half of the Attitude Era began, with the introduction of people like Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and more. Hell, when the Radicals made their shocking jump from WCW in January of 2000, it would be on SmackDown, not Raw, in which they had their debut matches with WWF, a sign of just how much weight Vince McMahon was putting behind this secondary show. And it would also be on SmackDown that plenty of other iconic moments occurred throughout that year, moments like Mick Foley's transformation into Cactus Jack, Steve Austin briefly returning to blow up the DX Express, and The Rock doing his famous sliding people's elbow. Then there's the fact that so much of the McMahon-Helmsley era, which dominated a lot of WWF TV at the start of the millennium, would take place on the Blue brand, with it being there that both Triple H beat the Big Show for the WWF title, and Stephanie McMahon beat Jacqueline for the WWF Women's title. Needless to say then, as a counter to Thunder, this was a very successful experiment for WWF. And as a show which could stand right out there alongside Raw in terms of importance, it was even more successful. And that was all evidenced when, once WCW went under in 2001 and was bought out by Vince McMahon for pennies on the dollar, the Blue brand remained a key part of storyline advancement in WWF all throughout the Invasion angle. Hell, sometimes it would get bigger moments than the Red brand did. After all, how can we forget about the segment prior to Invasion in which the old Stone Cold returned? That all happened on SmackDown, as did the famous supermarket brawl between Steve Austin and Booker T. And as if that wasn't enough, it would be Smackdown which hosted the first live sports broadcast held in America after the events of 9/11, with this episode seeing the entire roster come out and stand together, heel and babyface alike, as they helped the nation to heal with 2 hours of entertainment. Sure, the fact this happened on the blue brand rather than the red one was more circumstantial than anything, but it certainly helped to add to the idea that what was taking place on Thursday nights was far more than just shoulder programming like Sunday Night Heat or Shotgun Saturday Night had been before it. But for all the early success SmackDown was having, it wasn't immune to having the format thrown out and things reworked in an all-new way, as come early 2002 there would be a big change in the air. Why was that? Well, this was the point where, realizing that them no longer having any competition was having a negative effect on their business, WWE decided to try and manufacture their own internal competitor. Yes, this was the point where Raw and SmackDown were split up and were given 2 separate rosters, with the idea here being that going forward, each show would have a unique writing team and would be fighting for supremacy over the other in the weekly ratings, just as Raw and Nitro had once been doing the same. Obviously then, this lit a fire under those who were in charge of the blue brand, namely Paul Heyman and Stephanie McMahon, to succeed at a higher level than the red brand. And it led to what many people consider to this day to be the golden era of SmackDown. What made this era so special? Well, while Raw was being crushed under the boot of Triple H's reign of terror, all while it was simultaneously trying to live off of the fumes of the Attitude Era with infamous moments like the HLA segment or the Katie Vick angle, the blue brand was going in a different direction altogether. Sure, it wasn't like there were none of the goofier moments to be found on SmackDown at all. No, segments like Billy and Chuck's wedding or the Tori Wilson, Dawn Marie, Al Wilson love triangle certainly had plenty of that. But back then, the show was a lot more focused on great in-ring wrestling above all else. Basically, this is what ECW would have looked like if it had lived on into the mid-2000s, something Paul Heyman has alluded to in the past when he said he imagined the Philly promotion morphing into something more akin to early Ring of Honor, where it would have been all about work rate rather than the same shock tactics which got over during the late 90s. And this was certainly a move which was well received by fans, as with the SmackDown 6 at the helm, Thursday nights largely became seen as the must-see night to tune into WWE, far more so than the flagship for a while. Who were the SmackDown 6? Well, they'd be made up of Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, Edge, Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Chavo Guerrero, a sextet of the best workers in the world back at that point in time. So as you would expect then, no matter which combination any of these 6 were put in over the next couple of years, whether it be trios, tag, triple threat, or singles action, they always delivered to the point that they soon became synonymous with the quality of the brand overall. But they weren't the only big names SmackDown had during the early days of the brand extension. No, there was also another major player to be found in none other than Brock Lesnar. Hell, it was Brock who ended up becoming the first blue brand exclusive world champion when he brought the undisputed title to SmackDown full-time in the autumn of 2002 after winning it from The Rock. And it was him who would go on to have a series of classic matches over that belt with Kurt Angle, with one of these matches, their 1-hour Iron Man bout on the September 18th episode of the Blue Brand, still being amongst the best WWE has ever given away on free TV, even to this day. But that wasn't the only great SmackDown moment Lesnar was involved in during those early days. No, there was also the time he and The Big Show quite literally destroyed the ring during a famous segment which caused their match to end early, a segment which still gets regularly replayed in retrospectives to this day. And then there was the feud he had with the other great mainstay of the blue brand during this era, the dead man himself, The Undertaker. That's right, so synonymous with SmackDown would Mark Calloway become here, so much a part of its DNA would he transform into, it became a full-blown meme after a while that whenever general manager Teddy Long wasn't putting people in tag team matches playa, he was having them go one-on-one with The Undertaker. That said, for as big as the Phenom was during the early to mid-2000s, he wasn't quite as beloved as Eddie Guerrero was. No, after coming back from the absolute brink of addiction, then beating the Beast for the WWE title at No Way Out in February of 2004, Eddie would return to his home of the Blue Brand as a conquering hero and a true bastion of everything which was making that brand so special. Not just the level of in-ring skill its performers had, but also the personality they exuded. Basically, what we're saying here is that it was almost universally agreed during this early to mid-2000s run that SmackDown was the best thing WWE had to offer. But for as great as it was, more changes were coming soon anyway. And the reason for that was because a whole new generation was about to rise to the top, something which would become evident on the night where a young performer named John Cena made his debut on the Blue Brand to challenge Kurt Angle. Fast forward to a couple of years after that, and Cena would be en route to becoming the biggest star in the entire industry, something he was doing by rising up the ranks of SmackDown as United States Champion and fending off the challenges of people like Carlito. Sure, once he actually won the WWE title from JBL at WrestleMania 21, he'd be moved over to Raw not long thereafter. But it wasn't like the Blue Brand didn't get a pretty decent make-good here, as in exchange they got the World Heavyweight Champion, Batista. And this then would formally start the whole new era of SmackDown, one in which both Batista and Edge would serve as its top acts, as by that point, the rated R superstar had also struck gold with his new cocky heel gimmick. Hell, each of these men would largely remain a part of Thursday nights all the way up until their respective exits in 2010 and 2011. That said, even with their star power leading the charge, it didn't take long for it to become apparent that this was the point the Blue Brand was truly slipping into Beast Show territory for the first time. Something which should have been evident as soon as the new franchise player was moved off of that show and over to the flagship almost as soon as he won the Big Boy belt. Come on now, the fact that SmackDown got the World Heavyweight title instead of the WWE title was, in hindsight, a sign of how it was slipping in importance as a brand here, because while both belts were, in theory, on the same level, everyone knew that the real world champion was the one over on Raw, as that was the one with the lineage going all the way back to George Hackenschmidt. It didn't matter if Booker T managed to have a great run with it as King Booker. It didn't matter if The Undertaker made it his own for a while. The World Heavyweight title was by then less a true top prize and more what the Intercontinental title had been back in the 80s, a high-level secondary piece of hardware. How would SmackDown try to get some of its momentum back now that this had firmly established them as the B brand? Well, the addition of up-and-coming names like CM Punk were one way, as during his Blue Brand feud with Jeff Hardy in the late 2000s, he really showed he could rise to the occasion. But as was becoming the case so often by then, this success only saw him eventually be moved over to the real A show, Raw. Honestly, there was a point here where as the 2010s arrived, it had never felt less important to tune in to what was happening on the secondary show. And that wasn't helped by the fact that network changes and, as a result, changes in the night in which the show aired frequently threw schedules into upheaval. Then, as if that weren't bad enough, SmackDown wrestlers starting to appear on Raw full-time basically turned the Blue Brand into little more than a recap show for what had been happening the prior Monday. Honestly, if the SmackDown 6 era had been the high point of the brand, then this was undoubtedly the low point, and the point where the show could have been canceled altogether and no one would have really batted an eye, as so few were bothering to even watch it on a regular basis anymore. Again though, this is not to say there was no reason to watch SmackDown at all during those dark days. No, whenever it was on the air, there were still glimmers of the old greatness it had, something which was evidenced in the run people like Jeff Hardy, Rey Mysterio, and Chris Jericho had as World Heavyweight Champion, or the latter days of The Undertaker's full-time schedule. Then of course there was the initial rise of Daniel Bryan with the big gold belt in 2011, or the Christian and Randy Orton feud that same year. Basically what we're saying here is there were still a few embers burning in that fire, even if the fire was almost burnt out completely. It's not like it ever dropped to the level of a Sunday Night Heat or anything. And that would be enough to see the show limp on to 2016, at which point it would get a second lease on life. What happened here? Well, with WWE deciding to reinstitute the brand extension, SmackDown suddenly had a purpose once more. That's right, going forward, it would once again have its own roster and its own titles, with the initial roster here managing to outshine the Raw one, just as it had done in the early 2000s. But then how could it not when it included people like Dean Ambrose, AJ Styles, John Cena, and Becky Lynch, just to name a few. Yes, it certainly helped the Blue Brand here that upon being moved over to Friday nights, it would be aired live again. But that wasn't the key factor in its fortunes turning around. No, the key factor was that it felt like it featured the best the main roster had to offer. After all, with Shane McMahon and Daniel Bryan, the two men running the show in kayfabe, being more motivated than ever to prove they could outdo what Stephanie McMahon and her rotating cast of general managers were doing over on Raw, they certainly weren't going to accept any less than the best, and that meant good times for fans watching. What were some of the highlights of this era of SmackDown? Well, the run of Dean Ambrose as WWE Champion might have had its low points, but at the very least, it established him as a guy who could be on that level, right there alongside his former Shield brothers Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins. And when it came time for AJ Styles' subsequent time on top, he was able to prove any doubters he ever had that he could carry a WWE brand on his shoulders. Sure, things like the Jinder Mahal reign were mistakes in hindsight, but they were balanced out by the initial rises of both Becky Lynch and Alexa Bliss in 2016, the Styles-Cena feud, the return of Daniel Bryan to the ring somewhat miraculously, and the work of others like Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, and Bray Wyatt, all while they were arguably at their creative peaks. Even The Miz got something of a late career revival while part of the Blue brand here when, after going off on the American Dragon on an episode of Talking Smack, SmackDown's post-show hosted by Bryan and Renee Young, he suddenly found himself getting critical acclaim by many for the first time. Critical acclaim which would continue all the way into both his WrestleMania feud with John Cena and his partnership with Shane McMahon not long after this. Really, there was a sense here that the Friday show was truly the land of opportunity as it was being advertised, a more focused and character-driven piece of television where people could catch a break in opposition to the often illogical antics found over on Raw on Monday nights come the mid to late 2000s. And all this would lead to another peak for the Blue brand when, in 2018 and heading into 2019, it suddenly found itself home to the two top programs in the company. The birth of Becky Lynch's The Man character, and the surprise arrival of Kofi Mania heading into WrestleMania 35. How would they manage with this task? Very well as it happened because, once more, it felt like Friday nights was the place to watch your weekly fix of main roster WWE TV. Sure, it helped them to gain a bigger audience once they were moved over to Fox, with this being the biggest platform the company had been on in years at that point, a true major network which all but guaranteed a massive increase in viewership on a weekly basis. But even if that hadn't been the case, SmackDown still felt like the better show when compared to Raw here, something which was evident in the fact that so many of the big stars like Roman Reigns, found a permanent home there come the end of the decade. Really, you could argue that while there were plenty of times in the past where the Blue brand was outshining the Red one, this was the first time that WWE had truly treated it like the A show, something they clearly wanted to do on account of it now being on a better network than Raw was. And that would continue to be the case for the next few years. Unfortunately, though, there would be some rough years during this time period too, as we were about to enter into the dreaded era of the lockdown. Yes, it was in early 2020 that the world shut down for about a year and a half, and because of this, suddenly no fans were allowed in attendance at any sporting events. So this was when WWE introduced the Thunderdome, a giant video screen wall in which fans could tune in from home. Now, it wasn't ideal, but it was the best that the company felt they could do given the circumstances. And it would be something we'd all get used to very quickly as on both Raw and SmackDown, it soon became the norm. But while Raw was understandably struggling in the Thunderdome era, SmackDown did have an ace they were about to play in order to get fans interested again, in spite of the lack of atmosphere. And that ace would make its presence felt at SummerSlam of that year when Roman Reigns returned to the ring. Yes, after taking time away to look after his health during the beginnings of the lockdown, Roman returned at SummerSlam, now with an all-new heel demeanor and a new manager at his side in the form of Paul Heyman. This then was the birth of both the Tribal Chief and the Bloodline, the storyline which would dominate WWE TV for the next several years. And because Roman was a SmackDown exclusive, it meant the majority of this angle would play out on the Blue brand, with this only further solidifying the idea that it was the A show. That's right, the antics of Roman, Heyman, the Usos, Solo Sikoa, and for a very notable period, Sami Zayn, would all be something you could really only see on Friday nights. And that makes it ground zero when discussing the hot streak the company was about to undergo. Hell, so much was SmackDown the #1 focus for WWE here. Once Roman Reigns beat Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 38 to unify both world titles and become undisputed WWE Universal Champion, he'd continue to mostly appear on SmackDown, meaning that if you wanted to see a world champion in WWE, you had to tune in on a Friday rather than a Monday. Obviously then, once crowds returned to arenas in mid-2021, this made the Blue brand the hottest ticket in comparison to Raw, and that would continue to be the case for the next couple of years as the Bloodline remained the nexus point which all WWE programming circled around. Drew McIntyre, CM Punk, Seth Rollins, Kevin Owens, Daniel Bryan, Edge, and of course Cody Rhodes. They all had some involvement with the Anoa'i family during this period, and that inevitably led them to SmackDown at points, even if this wasn't the show they'd been drafted to. But it wasn't just the Bloodline which was making SmackDown WWE's A show at the start of the 2020s. No, there was also the women's division, with this seeing previously featured players like Bianca Belair and Charlotte Flair getting to shine, all while newcomers to the main roster like Tiffany Stratton and Julia were also making a mark. Really then, it felt like it was the brand that had everything a WWE fan could want heading into the new decade. Of course, eventually the Roman Reigns world title run was going to have to end though, and when this happened, there were questions about how SmackDown would fare without such an all-encompassing angle driving it anymore, especially as by that time, the Tribal Chief was already a part-timer. But luckily, once the bloodline fell at WrestleMania 40, an all-new champion would be crowned in Cody Rhodes. And with Cody Rhodes now being a Smackdown exclusive act as a result of this, it kept the blue brand on top in the internal brand war, as he was by that point very clearly the biggest star the company had. Hell, by the time 2024 came around, Cody was the biggest babyface WWE had seen since the peak days of John Cena. That said, today he's not being asked to carry the show by himself. No, folks like Roman Reigns still make semi-regular appearances, and with John Cena largely finding a home on the blue brand during his retirement year, it's only continued to solidify the importance of SmackDown in a post-Bloodline world. Sure, it might not be on Fox anymore, and with Raw now being on Netflix worldwide and SmackDown still being on cable TV in America, it means that the tides have shifted again in terms of what's considered the A show. But that doesn't make what takes place on Friday nights a B show. Rather, it's more of a 1A, the Dwayne Johnson to the red brand Steve Austin, if you will. But then, how could it be considered anything less? Really, CM Punk and Rhea Ripley aside, most of the big stars remain on SmackDown, even post-Netflix debut. And that's what's going to keep it a powerful brand within WWE for some time to come. Hell, we could even see a situation in the not-too-distant future where it becomes the full A show again, and once more proves that despite its humble beginnings as a mere extra 2 hours of programming every week, it's turned into so much more. Yes, the legacy of SmackDown today is something which could have gone no further than the pilot stage, but which turned into one of the biggest shows in wrestling history. It was a roll of the dice, but a roll of the dice which paid off big time for WWE. Sure, it's had its ups and downs like with any show, but even at its lowest point during the early 2010s when it was basically the Raw recap show, it was still valuable enough for Vince McMahon to keep it on the air. And when it's been at its strongest, like it was during the SmackDown 6 era or the Fox era, it's been the jewel in the company's crown, something which, even during dark times for WWE, has proven to be a shining light. It's a show which has had to adapt to much change, with it bouncing around various time slots, nights of the week, networks, and lockdowns over the course of this run, but that's just made it stronger as the brand has been forced to learn how to adapt and reinvent itself on a regular basis. So while Raw will always be considered the flagship of WWE, and while NXT had the cool factor from the black and gold days which made it the alternative brand of the promotion in many ways, SmackDown might quietly be the best of them all. If nothing else, it's shown itself multiple times over to be the fans' show, one which acts as the land of opportunity for stars who might not be able to get the same chances on a Raw, all while often serving as the more wrestling-centric brand, as it did particularly well during the early 2000s. All of this is to say, don't expect SmackDown to be going anywhere in the future. No, expect it to continue going from strength to strength, getting further rooted in the pop culture landscape each and every week as this new TKO era of WWE uses all its power to make the house that The Rock built something truly worthy of bearing his name. The 90s were a battlefield in North American wrestling, and the two main forces fighting it out in that battle were WWF and WCW. But there was another group, a renegade third party who were arguably the most influential of them all in the long run, and that group was named ECW. Of course, for as much as Paul Heyman's Band of Merry Men changed the game back at the end of the millennium, they wouldn't survive long enough to see the fruit of their labors, as come 2001, they'd be finished. But just how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish right now. Now, to start this story, we have to go all the way back to the early 90s. That was when a small Philadelphia-based promotion named Eastern Championship Wrestling was formed by a local businessman named Todd Gordon. Eastern Championship Wrestling wasn't anything particularly special at this point, rather it was just another local indie, albeit one which was loosely affiliated with the National Wrestling Alliance. That said, even being affiliated with the NWA during the 90s wasn't the mark of pride it had been in prior decades, as by then, this once mighty organization was a shadow of its former self. Still, it was enough to get Todd Gordon access to some performers like Jimmy Snuka, Don Morocco, and Terry Funk, performers he wouldn't have otherwise been able to get access to. And this helped him to draw in crowds as he ran shows at local gyms and bars in the Philly area. Of course, the place he loved to run the most, though, was the now legendary 2300 Arena. Back then, however, this was not the mythical place it is today for wrestling fans. Rather, it was pretty much seen as being a bit of a dump. But that suited the spirit of what ECW was doing just fine, as they were already making a name for themselves as an outsider group who did things their own way. And this would only increase in 1993 once Paul Heyman was brought on board as the new booker of the promotion. Heyman was already a well-known figure in the industry on account of his run in WCW as Paul E. Dangerously. But after leaving that promotion under a cloud of lawsuits, he decided he wanted to try something different. What was that different thing he wanted to try? Well, it was nothing less than to revolutionize the entire industry. Yes, the way he saw it, wrestling had grown stale during the early 90s, with the big two in WWF and WCW both living on the fumes of what had been successful during the 80s. To Paul, it was the equivalent of hair metal. And anyone who was around in the early 90s will tell you that hair metal was wiped off the face of the earth once grunge came along. So he wanted Eastern Championship Wrestling to be the industry's version of Nirvana then. And the way he set about doing that was by embracing the counterculture. That's right, unlike what the major leagues were doing in 1993, Heyman was going to be all about violence in the form of bloody, hardcore brawls. But it wasn't just this he wanted to present with his vision of ECW. No, he also wanted the best technical wrestling, something he brought into the territory by booking young rookies like Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, and Chris Benoit. Really, it was a melting pot of everything which was making wrestling exciting on the underground scene back then. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle to be put into place in order to fully light the fuse on this revolution. Luckily then, it wouldn't be much longer before that piece fell into place, because it would be in the summer of 1994 that Eastern Championship Wrestling hosted a one-night tournament to crown the new NWA World Champion after that belt had been vacated. And the person booked to win this tournament was ECW's own Shane Douglas. What the National Wrestling Alliance weren't aware of ahead of this time, however, was that prior to going out there and winning, Shane Douglas was instructed by both Paul Heyman and Todd Gordon to throw the World Heavyweight title down on the ground after he was awarded it, then from there proclaim himself to be the Extreme Championship Wrestling World Champion instead. Needless to say then, when this happened, it was a major moment and it upset a lot of people in the NWA. But neither Heyman, Gordon, or Douglas cared about this. No, their goal had been achieved, as they'd now officially put this new rebranded version of ECW on the map. Yes, what the trio were doing here was rejecting wrestling's past in favor of a new future they hoped to build. And the future was something they'd continue to build as the weeks and months went on, and the 2300 Arena became home to some of the most exciting wrestling shows of the era. Of course, it helped that the company had a great roster to push them forward, a roster of outsiders who were the runts of the litter and that they weren't welcomed anywhere else in the industry. But that didn't matter, because in Extreme Championship Wrestling, they could find a home where they'd be welcomed fully as part of a family of renegades ready to make their own stamp on the business. Sure, bigger names like Cactus Jack, Steve Austin, and even Dusty Rhodes would pop in from time to time, and legends like Terry Funk would continue to make regular appearances. That said, the real core of the promotion were the homegrown stars. Stars like Tommy Dreamer, the man who was, in many ways, the heart and soul of Extreme Championship Wrestling. Why was this? Well, despite starting off as a white meat babyface who was roundly rejected by the fan base, Dreamer would eventually win the hardcore faithful over by taking a savage beating one night with a kendo stick, with this proving just how far he was willing to go for the cause. And make no mistake, come 1995, ECW was very much a cause, as those who were watching it saw it as a breath of fresh air, the antithesis to everything the big two were doing. To those fans, this was the real cool wrestling company to watch, the one only those in the know knew about. And it made all the shows which happened in Philly feel like an event, as the overall goal amongst everyone there seemed to change the entire industry from the ground up. And it wasn't just Tommy Dreamer they were rooting for as they were doing this. No, while he may have been the main character of the show in many ways, there were plenty of other prominent figures in people like Raven, a brooding gothic misanthrope, the Sandman, a beer-drinking lunatic who'd usually busted himself open before he even made it to the ring, Taz, an MMA-inspired human suplex machine, and Sabu, someone who could best be described by his nickname of the homicidal, suicidal, genocidal, death-defying maniac. And that was just a portion of the roster on display here. So it's easy to see then why this had such a different vibe from a WWF or a WCW, as these were the kinds of characters you were never going to get on any of those shows back then. Of course, more than anything else though, the real selling point of going to the 2300 Arena was the atmosphere, as it was unlike anything else in North American wrestling, closer to a cult vibe than it was a wrestling show. Honestly, what people loved most of all here was the brand of ECW itself and what it represented, and that was all a testament to just how well Paul Heyman had managed to position the entire endeavor as a movement for change by framing the big two as the villains to be overcome. Yes, if you wanted to be an ECW fan back in 1995 and 1996, you weren't going to see much of it on TV. So that meant if you didn't live in the Philly area, you were going to have to engage in tape trading. And all this only added to the myth that was building around the promotion. So big did things get after a certain point that, in 1995, after WWF's King of the Ring show was drowned out by protest chants of ECW from the crowd, the top company out there were forced to admit that something was happening here. Not that this would see them change the style of their product quite yet though. No, the way WWF, and WCW for that matter, attempted to combat the growing threat of ECW back during the mid-90s was to sign away as much of their talent as they could with the promise of big money contracts. You see, while Paul Heyman was certainly great at rallying people around him and was excellent at getting fans to treat Extreme Championship Wrestling like a quasi-religion, one thing he was not so good at was managing the financial side of things. So because of that, he and Todd Gordon's company was always running on fumes when it came to money, and that meant pay was usually pretty low. And this situation didn't get any better once 1997 came around, as it would be at that point that Todd Gordon himself, the owner and main financial backer of the promotion, was ousted when it came to light that he'd been secretly acting as a mole for WCW, helping to get them the best talent from the ECW roster for a cheap price. Yes, after the entire locker room rebelled against him here, Gordon agreed to step down and sell the company to Paul Heyman outright, with this marking the point the future wise man fully took over things. What would his plan be to try and make the company more financially stable now that this was his responsibility entirely? Well, that would be to get ECW on pay-per-view, something he achieved on April 13th, 1997 when he helmed Barely Legal. That's right, this was a groundbreaking moment for the Philly promotion as it put them one step closer to being on the same level of WWF and WCW, all while they were still able to maintain that renegade punk rock edge they had during their early days with a truly hardcore show. And what a show this was to start a new era of Extreme, as it saw highlights like Taz and Sabu finally locking horns after over a year of teasing a fight, Shane Douglas defend his television title successfully, and in the main event, Terry Funk fully embraced the hardcore movement of this new generation by beating Raven to win the ECW World title. Honestly, if you wanted to call this one of the better shows of the era overall, we wouldn't argue with you, as it gave new fans a taste of everything which made the company so exciting. After all, while the blood and guts and violence were certainly a huge part of the show, that wasn't the only thing which people watched ECW for. No, they also watched for the excellent stories. Stories like the aforementioned one between Taz and Sabu, or the even better one between Tommy Dreamer and Raven, which saw the babyface continually try to pin his rival in the middle of the ring and never be able to do so. Of course, for as great as the character and stories were though, and for as exciting as the trademark violent hardcore brawls held at the 2300 arena could be to watch, one thing ECW could never count on was the same roster being around for too long, as by then both WWF and WCW were intensifying their efforts to sweep all of their talent up. But that wasn't too much of a problem for Paul Heyman, because he could always make new stars, and some of the newer stars who had risen to the forefront by this point to complement the rest of the roster were names like Rob Van Dam, the Dudley Boys, and New Jack. What made these acts so engaging? Well, in Rob Van Dam, you had someone who was unlike any other wrestler of his time in that most of his style was built upon his kickboxing background. So this made him a true one-of-a-kind to watch then, as his matches against the likes of Jerry Lynn soon became a thing of legend for tape traders and early message board posters. And when it came to the Dudleys, well, they got over not just with their fighting, but also with their promos where primarily Bubba Ray would take the helm and fire off at the crowd around him with some of the most R-rated insults you could imagine. Then, of course, there was New Jack, a walking lawsuit if there ever was one. Honestly, if anyone personified the spirit of ECW, then it might have been him, as his appearances often devolved into truly dangerous situations, as could be clearly seen in the now infamous mass transit incident where he damn near ended the life of a 17-year-old boy in the ring when he bladed him so deeply he almost bled out right there and then. As you would expect then, while this certainly made New Jack a spectacle, it made it hard to book him, as often whenever Extreme Championship Wrestling ventured outside of the 2300 arena, promoters would want nothing to do with this madman. But whenever he was allowed to show up, you could be guaranteed the sounds of Ice Cube's Natural Born Killers would send the crowd into a frenzy, as he became just another example of why you had to watch ECW, as it was giving you something you quite simply were not going to get anywhere else. That said, while you were never going to see anything as crazy as New Jack on a WWF or a WCW show, by the time 1997 and 1998 had come around, those two promotions were very much starting to catch up to the way the wind was blowing. Yes, as it turned out, ECW had been able to spark a revolution in wrestling because by now everyone was cribbing heavily from them in order to make their own products more exciting. For WWF, this meant the rise of anti-heroes like Stone Cold Steve Austin and the Attitude Era took hold, and for WCW, it meant the hostile takeover of a street gang in the form of the New World Order. Hell, WWF would actually bring ECW into the fold at one point and invite them onto their own TV in a cross-promotional event. Obviously then, this was a bizarre sight to witness as few thought they'd ever see acts like Tommy Dreamer, The Sandman, and Sabu on an episode of Raw. But it happened, and it helped out both parties because aside from making WWF feel a little bit cooler by rubbing shoulders with the Outlaws, it also gave Paul Heyman and his crew a boost as from this point onwards, Vince McMahon would start paying him. Why was Vince paying Heyman here? Well, he wanted to have Extreme Championship Wrestling serve as a developmental arm of sorts for his own company going forward. And, always in need of money, Paul E would happily accept this offer. Of course, he couldn't tell either his locker room or his fan base what was happening though. No, he had to maintain the idea that they were a rebel group fighting a cause of righteous violence against the Big Two. And so that was why he kayfabed everyone here, letting no one else know that WWF were, at least in part, secretly funding the whole operation from there on in. And this wasn't the only way Heyman was attempting to secure the future of ECW as the late 90s took hold. No, in the wake of the Big Two getting edgier themselves, he was also looking for other ways to differentiate his own promotion and make it stand out from the crowd fully again. Thankfully then, he would be able to do that by bringing in even more outside talents from the world of lucha and puroreso, talents which hadn't really been able to get a platform in North America prior to this. So with all the different styles on display here, combined with the great storytelling, extreme levels of violence, and fantastic technical wrestling in the undercard, he was clearly pushing the message that, rather than just being a niche product, ECW had something for everyone. Sure, they might still have been without the money that the other two had, and this continued to be a problem for them when it came to keeping a hold of many of their talents. But they were able to make up for that with a reputation that preceded itself, a reputation which continues to flaunt the idea that even if the competition were now both in boom periods of their own, ECW was still the wrestling company to watch for all the cool kids out there, as that was the one which truly represented the counterculture. Hell, that image Heyman was able to push would be enough to help the Philly promotion achieve their next big landmark moment soon after this, as it was in 1999 that after years of their weekly TV only being available in local markets, they finally got nationwide exposure by signing a deal with TNN. Yes, at this point, Extreme Championship Wrestling had firmly established themselves as something approaching another powerhouse in North American wrestling, as now, not only did they have pay-per-view, but like both WWF and WCW, they also had a big television deal, or at least a big one for them. But while this TV deal initially felt like a saving grace for ECW and a way of keeping them completely financially secure for the foreseeable future, in the end, the TNN deal turned out to be a bit of a poison chalice. And the reasons for that became more apparent as time went on. At least initially, however, it represented a major boon for the Philly company, as it put them on another level of national exposure, not anywhere near the level of their competition, but certainly significantly higher than they'd been before. Really, if there was ever a time where Extreme Championship Wrestling was going to stop being a cult phenomenon and fully break into the mainstream, this would have been it. But alas, that was not the way things worked out in the end. Why was this? Well, as the months went on, the relationship between Paul Heyman and TNN became more and more combative, with Paul E quickly realizing that the network saw his promotion as little more than second-string content, a test case to see if pro wrestling would get over in their network before eventually making a push to get a bigger league like WWF. On top of that, so much of what had made ECW exciting was completely neutered now that they were on a larger network, as the same level of violence and edgy content fans have been accustomed to before simply wouldn't fly with a big company like that. No, the antics of Steve Austin were one thing, but New Jack, the Sandman, and Sabu were another thing entirely. So this meant everything got a little bit less authentic feeling. And for a promotion which had built their entire reputation on the idea that they were an authentic representation of the counterculture, a true alternative to what was seen elsewhere in North American wrestling, this was a major blow to their credibility, and it would cause many fans who had followed their causes from the early days to begin tuning out. And that was only the start of the Philly company's problem as 2000 came around, as this year would see even bigger issues arise. Issues like a number of big names all leaving to go join the competition in a short space of time. Yes, over a matter of mere months, ECW lost the Dudley Boys to WWF, Taz to WWF as well, and Mike Awesome to WCW. Obviously then, in the case of the Dudley Boys, this did severe damage to Paul Heyman's tag team division, as by then, Bubba Ray and Devon really had become the centerpiece of the entire thing. And in the case of Taz, losing someone who was so synonymous with the promotion made it feel like a real lesser league once more, a place where the true stars would always inevitably get poached away by someone bigger. That said, for as damaging as these losses were, the most damaging of all was arguably Mike Awesome. And the reason for this was because he was the ECW World Champion when he split for Atlanta. So that led to a truly unique situation taking effect where, in order to get their belt back, Awesome would have to come back to the company for one night only in order to drop it. Who would he drop the title to here? Well, surprisingly, it wouldn't be an Extreme Championship Wrestling guy. No, instead it would be a returning Taz, now a WWF employee, who made a one-night comeback of his own in order to bring the belt home. That's right, in one of the most truly bizarre situations in wrestling history, an ECW title would be fought over by a WWF employee and a WCW one at a Paul Heyman-produced event. And while Taz would win the belt here, him holding it didn't exactly do much for the credibility of the now struggling company either, because on the very next episode of Smackdown, he'd return to WWF to get beaten by then WWF champion Triple H. Obviously, the message was clear then, ECW's best just couldn't hang with Vince McMahon's best. And that only further served to damage the already increasingly damaged reputation of the Philly promotion. But while all these exits and the muddled title situation which came out of it led to a lowering of fan morale as well as locker room morale, the people who had left felt very justified in doing so because despite ECW still being on TNN here, money issues were getting worse by the week. So bad were things getting, in fact, many prominent members of the roster were going months at a time without being paid at all, with some of them ending up being owed amounts by Paul Heyman which added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Why was this happening to a company which had such a strong cult fan base and a solid TV deal? Well, as we mentioned earlier, there were many skills Heyman had. Being a great businessman was not one of them. No, he might have been an excellent promoter when it came to hyping up a show, and might have had a great mind for creating engaging storylines and characters, but when it came to the financial aspect of things, he was notorious for letting things fall apart. As Lance Storm himself noted at one point, despite loving working for ECW, he had no choice but to threaten to quit the company after missing 2 paychecks in a row, as he simply couldn't afford to provide for his family this way. And he represented the vast majority of the roster in this mindset. So whenever WWF or WCW came along looking to sign a talent to a big money guaranteed contract, it was a no-brainer that most would say yes to this, even if they believed in the revolution ECW was spearheading. Hell, it wasn't even just the wrestlers who weren't being paid anymore at the start of the millennium. No, it was also vendors, production staff, and even venues. Yes, things had reached a stage where, if something drastic didn't change soon, Extreme Championship Wrestling was going to be on the verge of bankruptcy, even with that extra WWF money still coming in. Still though, in spite of this, there were some on the roster who continued to remain loyal to Heyman, and the reason for that was because so good was he at rallying his troops, he could make a good portion of them forget all about the issues the company was having with one well-placed speech. Some have called him the David Koresh of wrestling, in that he truly did act like a cult leader in this respect, able to gain loyalty for life from his followers. Again, that was part of the way ECW had been marketed to the fan base for years by then. It wasn't a simple wrestling company. No, it was a full-blown social movement. But no matter how well the owner of the promotion was able to keep his faithful behind him, the reality was that as 2000 was drawing to an end, money problems just got worse and worse. And this led to the final death blow happening when TNN announced it was canceling ECW in exchange for WWF programming. So now, without a TV deal, and being unable to negotiate a new one with anyone else in the immediate aftermath as a result of legal technicalities, there were simply no more aces in the hole left for Paul Heyman to play. No, once 2001 began, it was over. In fact, the last ECW show ever held in its original incarnation would take place on January 13th of that year in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. After that, the roster awaited news of another event being booked, with them only finding out that the company was done when Heyman appeared on Raw in March of that same year as a replacement commentator for Jerry Lawler. Yes, in the end it all finished with a whimper, and one which many of the roster who were remaining took as a betrayal as, after all those years of telling them WWF and WCW were the enemy, Paul E ended up going to one of them himself once the money ran out. From his point of view, however, he had no choice but to do this. After all, he needed a job as there was simply no more money left. All he could do with regards to the company he'd built was officially file ECW for bankruptcy in April of 2001, and from there watch as all the assets he once used to help breathe new life into the North American wrestling scene were sold off. But even if it was gone now, the legacy of Extreme Championship Wrestling would continue to live on, with its legend only growing stronger in the years since. Yes, today this small promotion is rightly remembered as being the one which completely changed the game back during the late 90s and which really served as ground zero for the boom period which was to come. Seriously, without ECW, you don't get the Attitude Era. And that's why over the years, WWE has only been too happy to give fans occasional reunion events for the promotion, with the most famous of these probably being One Night Stand 2005. Sure, WWECW was never as great as the original, but everything else has only furthered its reputation as one of the most important wrestling companies of all time, so much that its influence is still being felt to this day. But then we guess that's just a testament to how great ECW was and how much it was something which will never be replicated again.